Long before the first temples rose from stone or the earliest cities stirred with noise and trade, ancient humans walked upon the earth with quiet purpose. They moved through wide-open spaces beneath skies untouched by the glare of modern light across a world that was at once vast and intimate. Every rock, tree, and river had meaning. Life was lived close to the land, and time moved differently, measured not by minutes, but by seasons, migrations, and the slow rhythms of survival. In this world, the story of humanity began not in shouts or battles, but in small, careful steps. It began in footprints pressed into damp earth, in tools shaped by hand, in firelight flickering against stone walls. These first people were not alone in the world. They were part of a great family, a branching tree of early humans whose paths often overlapped. There was Homo habilis, perhaps the first to shape stone tools with deliberate care, who lived in the African landscapes over 2 million years ago. Later came Homo erectus, taller and more adaptable, who journeyed farther than any of their predecessors. And then, scattered across Europe and Asia, lived the Neanderthals, strong and resourceful, their minds attuned to cold, challenging environments. Each of these human relatives left behind traces of their lives: hearths, bones, hunting sites, and curious objects still being uncovered today. Our species, Homo sapiens, emerged in Africa around 300,000 years ago. In the beginning, they were not much different from their cousins. They used similar tools, hunted the same animals, and shared the same struggles. But gradually, something began to shift. Over thousands of years, early Homo sapiens developed new ways of thinking, new forms of expression, and deeper layers of social life. They made ornaments from shells and bones. They painted images on cave walls. They shaped tools with refined precision. And perhaps most importantly, they began to communicate in ways more complex than ever before, through gestures, symbols, and the earliest spoken languages. The Earth during this time was changing. Great ice sheets advanced and retreated, sculpting the land with glaciers and shaping migration patterns. Environments ranged from dense forests to open tundra, and ancient humans adapted to them all. Their survival depended not only on strength, but on memory, the ability to pass down knowledge, to recall where water could be found, where animals gathered, and which plants healed or harmed. This knowledge lived in the minds of elders, carried forward through quiet teachings, campfire stories, and imitation. Community was everything. No one survived alone. Early humans lived in small bands, often fewer than 30 individuals, bound together by shared labor and mutual care. Every member had a role. Some gathered food, others shaped tools, others tended the fire or watched the young. The bond between people was not just practical, it was emotional too. Archaeological sites have revealed signs of care for the sick and elderly, signs of deliberate burial, and hints of ritual behavior. These were not just survival machines, they were thinkers, feelers, social beings capable of love, grief, and memory. As early humans spread across the globe, they adapted to astonishingly diverse environments. They crossed deserts and mountains, followed coastlines and rivers, and found ways to survive in icy tundra and tropical forests alike. This was not a wave of sudden conquest, but a slow, cautious exploration. They didn't know they were mapping the future of a species. They were simply seeking safety, sustenance, and space to live. Along the way, they left behind fragments of themselves, not just bones, but stories told in stone and ash. One of the most striking features of early Homo sapiens is their creativity. Even in the harshest conditions, they made time for expression. Cave paintings in Europe and Asia show animals, handprints, and mysterious symbols. Some are tens of thousands of years old. They used ochre to mark their bodies and etched abstract patterns into bone and rock. Jewelry made from teeth and shells hints at a desire not just to survive, but to decorate, to represent, to belong. These were not simple instincts. They were acts of meaning, and meaning was woven into everything they did. Fire, for example, was more than warmth or cooking. It was a gathering place, a center of light in a world of darkness. Around fires, early humans likely shared stories, taught children, healed wounds, and planned their next move. The flickering flame may have also marked the beginning of reflection, time to wonder, to dream, to remember those who came before. Genetic evidence now shows that as Homo sapiens moved across the continents, they sometimes met and interbred with other human species. Most modern humans today carry traces of Neanderthal or Denisovan DNA woven quietly into our genomes. This mixing tells a story not of competition alone, but of connection, of relationships formed, however fleeting, across boundaries of kind. The legacy of these ancient humans lives in us still, in our hands that shape, in our minds that wonder, in our voices that tell. They may have lived in a quieter world, without writing or machines, but they carried within them the same sparks we feel today, the desire to explore, to create, to understand, and to belong. And so the footsteps continue, leading us softly from the first humble tools to the glowing coals of fire, where stories and shelter waited in the night. The rhythm of life in the ancient world was shaped not by cities or clocks, but by the pulse of the land and the movement of the seasons. As early humans ventured further from their ancestral homelands in Africa, they encountered a planet in flux. The Earth's climate shifted gradually over thousands of years, entering a long glacial phase, what we now call the Ice Age. In the far north, massive sheets of ice stretched across continents, pressing down upon the land, carving valleys, and shifting coastlines. Even in milder zones, the air was colder, the winters longer, the survival harder, and yet life endured. The people who lived at the edges of these frozen realms learned not only to survive, but to adapt in remarkable, enduring ways. It was in this cold and unpredictable world that fire took on its deepest meaning. More than just a practical tool, fire became a lifeline, a source of heat in icy winds, a way to cook food that would otherwise spoil or sicken, a defense against predators lurking in the dark. The act of creating fire, once a rare and difficult feat, became an essential skill passed down through generations. Flint was struck against iron-rich stones to create sparks. Tinder was gathered carefully, dry leaves, fine bark, or animal dung, all coaxed into flame with gentle breath. And once fire was born, it was guarded closely, kept alive through the night, fed with care, protected like a living thing. In the glow of firelight, the world transformed. Cold stones became warm, safe places. Faces became visible, shadows danced across cave walls, and the flickering light brought people closer together. Fire created space for pause, for cooking, for sharing, for storytelling. It offered more than safety. It offered comfort, familiarity, even memory. Around these flames, early humans likely formed their first quiet rituals. Meals were prepared communally, using stone tools to cut, crush, and stir. Bones cracked open for marrow, seeds ground into pastes, and meat roasted slowly over embers. The smells of smoke and cooking would have lingered in the air, clinging to skin, hair, and fur clothing. With fire came shelter, not just the natural protection of caves and rock overhangs, but the first signs of deliberate homemaking. In cold environments, humans built structures from wood, bone, and hide. Mammoth tusks were arranged in circular frames, covered with animal skins, and insulated with mud or turf. Inside, a hearth glowed softly at the center, warming the small space and warding off the wind. Outside, fires were also used to shape the land, to clear brush, attract animals, or mark boundaries. This was a landscape not just inhabited but tended. Life at the edge of the Ice Age was demanding, but it also fostered deep ingenuity. Clothing, for instance, became a critical technology. Early humans learned to tan hides, sew with bone needles, and layer materials for insulation. Furs were worn with the warmth inward, carefully tied with leather cords. Boots were padded with grass or moss. In colder regions, layered outfits protected the body during long hunts or icy treks. These weren't random wrappings, they were crafted with care, shaped to fit, adjusted for movement, and passed from hand to hand, generation to generation. The social life of early humans also deepened in these conditions. Cooperation became essential, A single person could not bring down a reindeer, defend against a cave lion, or navigate a snowstorm alone. Trust became the thread that held groups together. Tasks were divided, skills shared, and knowledge exchanged. Children grew up not only learning by watching, but by doing, by helping prepare hides, gathering fuel, and listening to stories passed down during the long winter nights. Memory was a form of technology, carried not in books but in the minds and mouths of elders. And what were these stories like? Though we cannot know their words, we can imagine their shape. Perhaps they spoke of animals and seasons, of spirits and ancestors, of journeys and lessons. The presence of cave art and decorated tools suggests a symbolic world, one rich in meaning, metaphor, and wonder. These weren't just people reacting to nature, they were people trying to understand it, to explain the forces around them, to find their place in something larger than themselves. A carved figurine, a painted bison, a buried necklace, each may have held a story deeper than utility. Burial practices from this time also hint at complex inner lives. In some places, individuals were laid to rest with care, bodies positioned, ochre sprinkled over bones, grave goods placed nearby. These were not acts of mere disposal. They speak of mourning, of remembrance, perhaps even belief in some form of afterlife or ancestral presence. In the cold, uncertain world of the Ice Age, death was never far, and so it is perhaps no surprise that humans sought to give it meaning. The animals of this age were majestic and immense. Woolly mammoths, with their towering height and sweeping tusks, roamed the plains. Giant deer, cave bears, rhinos, and saber-toothed cats shared the landscape. Some were hunted, others were feared, all were watched closely, their behaviors noted, their movements followed. Early humans became expert trackers, reading footprints in snow and earth, noting the signs of passage, broken twigs, droppings, disturbed stones. This deep attentiveness to the land became part of human identity. Even today, remnants of this quiet watchfulness live in our instincts, our stories, our ways of seeing. The edge of the Ice Age was not just a time of hardship, it was a time of learning, of crafting, of coming together in new ways. Beneath the glaciers and across the windswept steppes, early humans did not just survive, they built lives. Around fires, beneath hides, under stars veiled in frost, they found moments of peace, of laughter, of rest. And from those moments, something enduring began to take root, the foundations of society, of culture, of human belonging. As the earth slowly warmed and the ice began its retreat, these ancient communities stood ready. They had learned how to live with nature, how to shape it, and how to carry their knowledge forward. And so, with the thaw came movement once more, a new phase of exploration, and with it, the stirrings of expression more vivid than ever before. Ahead lay the deep, mysterious spaces of painted caves, where shadows and spirit merged. In the silence of ancient landscapes, where grasses bent with the wind and rivers carved quiet paths through stone, early humans turned their attention to the shapes around them. They watched how rocks broke, how edges split, how one material could change the nature of another. And in their slow, careful way, they began to shape the world with their hands. This was the beginning of technology, not in grand inventions or gleaming machines, but in the intimate gesture of striking stone against stone. The first tools were born not from sudden genius, but from observation, repetition, and memory passed from one generation to the next. The earliest stone tools we know of date back over 2.5 million years. They were simple flakes, sharp-edged pieces knocked from larger rocks. These flakes were used for cutting meat, scraping hides, and shaping wood or bone. They were not crude, as they are sometimes described. Even the simplest tool required knowledge, which stone to choose, how to hold it, where to strike. The skill of flint knapping, as we now call it, is both precise and subtle. It involves reading the stone, understanding its grain, its angles, its rhythm. A missed strike can ruin the whole piece. A clean break, however, can produce a blade sharp enough to slice through tendon or sinew with ease. As time passed, tools became more refined. Humans learned to shape not only flakes but cores, intentionally sculpted stones designed to produce multiple usable pieces. They began to create points for hunting, scrapers for processing hides, and even tools with multiple parts, handles bound with sinew or cord, shafts fitted with stone blades. Each object was a quiet triumph of understanding, not just of materials but of purpose. These tools extended the reach of the hand, expanded what the body could do, and gradually altered the balance between people and the natural world. But tools were not only functional, some were symmetrical, carefully balanced, even beautiful. The Acheulean hand axe, for example, used for over 1 million years by Homo erectus and early Homo sapiens, is often found in forms so precise they seem almost ceremonial. With its teardrop shape and finely chipped edges, it speaks to more than just utility. Perhaps these tools carried meaning, perhaps they showed skill, status, or care. We cannot know their full purpose, but we can feel the intention in their making, the way hands pressed and turned, chipped and smoothed, again and again until the form felt right. These hands were sensitive. They knew the weight of stone, the tension of fiber, the grain of wood. Early humans likely used many natural materials that have not survived: soft woods, woven grasses, bone needles, sinew cords. These were not throwaway items, but tools crafted with attention and kept close. Some may have been passed from parent to child, kept in bundles, wrapped with care. The act of making something, of giving shape to raw matter, became a quiet form of expression, one as old as humanity itself. The making of tools also shaped the body. Archaeologists can trace the wear patterns on ancient bones, muscle attachments, finger joints, and shoulder sockets that reflect the repetitive motions of tool use. These people were strong, yes, but also finely attuned. The strength was not just in force, but in endurance, coordination, and sensitivity. Over time, the brain changed too. Tool making required planning, sequencing, and imagination. It demanded a sense of cause and effect, a vision of the outcome before the first strike. In this way, technology and cognition grew together, each shaping the other in quiet tandem. Children would have learned by watching, sitting near their elders. They would have picked up stones, mimicked gestures, tested edges. Mistakes would be common: cuts, bruises, broken pieces, all part of the learning. But over time, through repetition and quiet correction, skill would blossom. A boy or girl who could make a good scraper or strong spear point was not just a learner, but a contributor, a vital part of the group. Some tools were used for hunting, others were used for gathering, for food preparation, or for shaping other tools. Still others may have been used in rituals, games, or teaching. The line between practical and symbolic was not always clear. A decorated tool could be both beautiful and useful. A smooth stone might hold memory as well as function. Even today, some of the most mysterious artifacts we find, shaped stones, carved bones, strange figurines, resist easy explanation. Their purpose may lie somewhere between hand and heart. As tools advanced, so did the methods of making them. By the time of the Upper Paleolithic, around 40,000 years ago, early Homo sapiens were producing tools of remarkable variety and specialization. Blades were long and thin, shaped with incredible precision. Harpoons and needles appeared, as did stone burints used for engraving. Composite tools, combining wood, stone, and binding, allowed for complex designs. These tools opened new possibilities: improved hunting, better clothing, more effective shelters. With each refinement, humans expanded the boundaries of their world, step by patient step. The creation of tools also reflected a deeper awareness of time. Each tool carried the memory of its making and the promise of future use. To make a tool was to look ahead, to imagine the need, the moment, the task to come. In this way, tools became not just extensions of the hand, but of the mind. They stitched together past, present, and future in silent, enduring ways. And so, with stone in hand and thought in motion, ancient humans walked further. They left their marks not only in bones or fire pits, but in the objects they shaped and carried. With each step, the world became more legible, more pliable, more human, and just as tools shaped the world, they shaped the self, giving form to intention, structure to instinct, and perhaps a glimpse of something sacred. Ahead, in the shelter of caves and beneath overhangs of stone, the walls themselves would begin to speak, not in words, but in images. A new form of expression was dawning, painted in ochre and shadow. Deep beneath the earth, where the sunlight fades and silence pools like water, ancient humans began to speak in a new language, one made not of words, but of image and gesture. In cool caverns, hidden from the open air and warmed only by flickering fire, they painted, they engraved. They traced the outlines of dreams and animals, of movement and presence. These spaces, now still and hushed, once echoed with the breath of artists and observers, with the crackle of torchlight and the soft rustle of footsteps on stone. And though the voices are gone, the images remain vivid and stirring, as if waiting for us to understand. The oldest known cave paintings are over 40,000 years old. Some are found in Europe, in places like Chauvet, Altamira, and Lascaux, while others appear in Indonesia, Australia, and southern Africa. These distant locations suggest something remarkable, that the impulse to create art was not confined to one group or region. It was something widespread, something deeply human. The need to make marks, to leave behind signs, to transform blank surfaces into living stories. This was a thread that stretched across continents, carried in the hearts and minds of early people wherever they went. What they painted tells us much, but also leaves much unsaid. There are images of animals, bison and horses, lions and stags, rhinos and mammoths. They run in profile, captured mid-stride, sometimes layered one upon another as if in motion or memory. Some are outlined in black, others filled with ochre, red, or white. Hands too are common, pressed against the walls in bursts of pigment, fingers spread wide. Many are stencils, made by placing a hand on stone and blowing powdered paint around it, leaving behind the negative space like a ghostly echo. Others are etched into the surface, scratched with stone tools, leaving grooves that catch the light in certain ways. But these images are not random. Their placement, the animals chosen, the repetition of certain forms, all suggest deliberate thought. Some appear in the deepest chambers of caves, far from the reach of daylight, accessible only through narrow passages and tight crawls. Why go so far, with torches and paints and tools? It may be that these places held special meaning, that the cave itself was part of the message. Perhaps it was seen as a womb, a threshold, a place between the worlds of the living and the unseen. Some researchers believe the images had spiritual or ritual purposes, part of ceremonies, to honor the hunt, to summon success, or to connect with the spirits of the animals themselves. Others see them as teaching tools, ways to pass on knowledge about species, movement, or territory. And still others suggest that the caves were used for altered states, trance, dreaming, or initiation. The acoustics of some chambers support this idea. Sound travels strangely, echoing and amplifying in ways that seem almost intentional. In such a place, the beat of a drum or the call of a voice would have surrounded the body, creating an immersive, even sacred experience. Whatever the intent, the craftsmanship is undeniable. Early artists used stone palettes, brushes made of moss or hair, and hollow bones for blowing pigment. They mixed minerals with animal fat or water to make paints that could withstand time itself. They studied the surfaces of the walls, the curves, the cracks, the textures, and incorporated these into their art. A bulge might become the shoulder of a bison. A fissure might mark the line of a leg or horn. In this way, they did not just paint on the cave. They painted with it, blending their vision with the earth's own contours. And yet there is humility in these works. No names are signed. No single artist claims the wall. The act of creation seems to have belonged to the community, or perhaps to something even larger, to the rhythm of life itself. These images were not meant to be admired in isolation. They were part of a shared space, a living environment, a setting for something felt but not fully known. And that is what makes them so powerful, even today. They resist full explanation, inviting not answers but reflection. Beyond the caves, other forms of ancient art began to appear. Small figurines carved from bone or ivory, often of animals or human forms, especially women, have been found across Ice Age Europe and Asia. Some are realistic, others abstract, their proportions exaggerated or symbolic. The famous Venus figurines, for example, may have represented fertility, womanhood, or ancestral memory. Or perhaps they were talismans, teaching tools, or expressions of care. Like the cave paintings, they offer more questions than answers, and yet they speak clearly of imagination, of vision, and of meaning. Even the simple act of marking, lines carved into antler notches on wood, grooves etched in stone, may have carried significance. These marks could have been calendars, counts, or memories. They may have helped track time, the moon, or the seasons. In a world without writing, every mark was a choice, a record, a gesture of presence. To create is to remember. It is also to hope, and so these ancient works, made in darkness and lit by flame, remind us of something enduring, that even in the harshest conditions, humans sought beauty. They sought connection. They sought to leave something behind. And as the Ice Age waned and the climate began to shift once more, those impulses would only grow. With warmer weather came new abundance, and with it the soft stirrings of language, rhythm, and song. Long before letters were carved into stone or ink flowed across parchment, the voice carried the weight of memory. In the earliest human communities, language was not something written or recorded, but something heard, shaped by the tongue, lifted by breath, shared between faces close together in firelight. It moved like wind through the tall grasses, soft and invisible, yet powerful enough to bind people together. And in that shared air, stories were born. They were not always told as we tell them now, with formal plots or endings. They were woven into gestures, rhythms, tones, and pauses. They lived in the body as much as in the mind, and they were passed not in books, but in song, repetition, and presence. The exact moment language emerged is hidden in time, a mystery etched only in the shape of bones and the echoes of behavior. But we know that even our ancient cousins, the Neanderthals, the Denisovans, likely had some form of vocal communication. The structure of their skulls, the complexity of their tools, and the traces of social life suggest they shared information in ways beyond mere sounds. And with the arrival of Homo sapiens, language seems to have flowered into something rich and flexible, capable of nuance, abstraction, memory, and meaning. At its core, language was a tool for connection. It allowed early humans to organize hunts, to share warnings, to teach children. But it also did something more subtle. It wove minds together. Through words, people could share not just facts but feelings. A memory could be passed along, a sorrow named, a joy described. Over time, certain phrases may have taken on ritual meaning, repeated at births, deaths, or the turning of seasons. Songs may have arisen, chants to mark a journey, lullabies to soothe a child, rhythms to lighten the burden of labor. In this way, language and emotion became intertwined, each shaping the other. Song, in particular, may have been one of the earliest forms of structured expression. Music does not require exact words to be felt. Its rhythms, tones, and repetitions can stir something deep and ancient in the listener. In groups, shared song creates unity. It sets a pace, marks a pattern, invites participation. Even today, cultures across the world use song to teach, to remember, to heal. We can imagine early humans humming as they walked, clapping rhythms as they worked, singing softly beneath the stars. These were not performances, but practices of presence, ways of anchoring the self in the world, of feeling held. Memory, too, was different in this time. Without writing, knowledge had to be carried in the mind, guarded and shared through story. Myths may have explained the origins of the world, tales may have taught caution, bravery, patience. Lineages were remembered, not through documents, but through names spoken aloud, again and again. Each story was a vessel, a bridge between generations. An elder's tale might be retold by a grandchild, decades later, reshaped by voice, but anchored in truth. These stories became a form of continuity, a soft thread binding the present to the past, the living to the dead, and not all stories were spoken. Gesture played a powerful role. The movement of hands, the angle of the head, the tone of silence, all carried meaning. Early humans likely used a blend of sound and sign, speaking with the full body, the full face. Laughter, sighs, cries, and even stillness had their place in the conversation. In the absence of paper or recording, the body itself became the archive, the voice the scribe. Shared memory also shaped space. Certain places may have held stories, a particular rock, a grove of trees, a spring. To visit that place was to revisit the tale, to honor those who had walked there before. In this way, memory was woven into the land, just as much as it was carried in the mind. The world itself became a living record, etched with meaning, known only to those who walked it. And as groups moved and resettled, they carried these memories with them, mapping new lands not just by sight, but by story. Over time, these threads of language, song, and memory formed the roots of what we might call culture. They gave shape to identity, purpose to ritual, rhythm to the day. A child born into such a world would grow up surrounded by sound, not the din of machines, but the gentle murmur of voices, the song of wind through branches, the cadence of feet on earth. They would learn to speak not just in words, but in the deeper patterns of belonging. Even in death, the voice may have lingered. Names spoken aloud kept the memory of the departed alive. Echoes of their stories would ripple forward, reaching new ears, shaping new hearts. The ancestors were not forgotten. They were spoken, sung, remembered. Their presence lived in lullabies, in warnings, in laughter, in the soft tones of a story, retold by firelight. And so, in these earliest voices, we hear the quiet beginning of something vast, a world where meaning was not kept in stone alone, but carried in sound, soft, fluid, living. A world where the past was not behind, but beside, walking with each person as they moved. From this rich soil of memory and music, new ideas would take root. Some of them would shape how people saw the land, not just as a space to cross, but as a source of spirit. And with time, people would begin to shape the land in return, leaving behind not just marks on cave walls, but great stones lifted skyward, aligned with the heavens. Across the hills and plains of ancient Europe, long before the first cities rose or the first empires marched, people were lifting stones. Not the small tools held in hand, but stones that stood taller than a person, broader than an ox, heavy beyond what a single human could carry. They rose from the earth like frozen giants, placed with care and effort, often in circles, rows, or carefully aligned clusters. These megaliths, meaning large stones, appeared in many regions, from the windswept shores of the British Isles to the quiet plateaus of France, from the green valleys of Iberia to the rocky coasts of Scandinavia. And though their builders left no written words, their message remains carved into the very shape of the land. Some of these stones stand alone, solitary figures on grassy knolls, casting long shadows as the sun moves across the sky. Others form patterns, great circles or horseshoe shapes, lines that stretch for hundreds of meters, or avenues leading toward distant horizons. Perhaps the most famous is Stonehenge, its weathered lintels balanced atop vertical pillars, forming an open-air chamber beneath the sky. But Stonehenge is only one of many. There are thousands of such sites scattered across Europe and beyond, each unique, each quietly echoing the lives and beliefs of those who built them. What did these stones mean? The answer is not simple, and perhaps it never was. But clues emerge from their positioning, their surroundings, and the subtle patterns of the earth. Many align with the movements of the sun or moon, rising at solstice, setting at equinox, tracing the cycles of light and shadow across the year. Others are placed near ancient burial sites, rivers, or hilltops. These connections suggest a relationship not only with the heavens, but with time, death, memory, and the land itself. In a world without calendars or clocks, these stones may have helped mark the seasons, guiding the planting of seeds or the celebration of return. To move such stones required planning, strength, and cooperation. Trees may have been used as rollers, ropes twisted from plant fiber or animal hide. Teams of people, perhaps whole communities, worked together, dragging, lifting, adjusting. The work was not hasty. It took days, weeks, even years. Each motion was deliberate, each stone chosen and shaped. The act of building was itself a form of devotion, not just to the sky or earth, but to each other. These were shared efforts, binding people through labor, vision, and ritual. And though we often focus on the stones, the spaces between them were just as meaningful. People gathered there, not in silence, but in song, speech, dance. Fires may have burned, drums may have sounded, voices may have echoed between the stones and into the dusk. These were places of convergence, where families met, where stories were told, where ancestors were remembered. Some sites show evidence of feasting, discarded bones, pottery fragments, remnants of shared meals. This was not only a spiritual act, but a social one. The stones stood still, but life moved around them. Burial was also a part of this sacred landscape. Long mounds of earth, called barrows or tumulate, were raised over the dead, sometimes with chambers built from stone within. In some cases, the deceased were laid with tools, ornaments, or pigments, their bodies carefully positioned. These graves were not hidden. They were visible, part of the land. In death, people joined the place, becoming part of the memory held in stone and soil. The past was not forgotten, it was lived with. Some megalithic structures took the form of passage tombs, long corridors leading into dark and closed spaces where sunlight entered only on specific days of the year. At Newgrange in Ireland, for example, the rising sun on the winter solstice shines through a narrow opening, illuminating the inner chamber in a moment of golden light. This event, still precise after thousands of years, speaks to a deep understanding of the sky and a desire to connect earth and heavens. For the builders, this may have been a moment of renewal, the return of light, the promise of warmth, the rebirth of the sun after its long decline. The art found within some of these spaces adds another layer of mystery. Spirals carved into stone, circles within circles, lines that curve and flow, not depicting, but suggesting. These patterns, repeated in many places, may have symbolized cycles, journeys, or visions. They may have been maps of meaning, known only to those who stood within and shared the songs and stories of the place. These megaliths stand at the edge between the world of mobile hunters and that of settled farmers. They emerge in the Neolithic, a time of profound change when people began to stay in one place, to plant and tend rather than chase and gather. Yet they carry something older, the memory of movement, the connection to sky and land, the rhythm of season and shadow. They are not mere monuments. They are thresholds between past and future, life and death, human and cosmos. Even now, walking among them, one can feel a hush. The stones do not speak, yet they are not silent. They hold stories not in language, but in presence. They are reminders that humans long ago stood in these same places, looked at these same stars, and wondered just as we do. And so, from stone and shadow, we move forward into a new age, when humans, learning to live from the land, would change not only their tools, but the shape of their days. For with the rise of farming came a quieter, deeper transformation, one that would reshape the world from root to roof. The world after the Ice Age was changing. The great glaciers, once vast and unmoving, had begun their long retreat, uncovering new landscapes shaped by meltwater and time. Rivers flowed freely through green valleys. Forests spread across once frozen plains. New animals grazed on tender shoots, and birds returned to nest in trees that hadn't stood in centuries. It was in this warming world, some 12,000 years ago, that humans began to linger, not just for a season, but for generations. Where once they had moved with the herds and gathered from the wild, they now began to shape the land around them, slowly, gently, and with quiet intent. Agriculture did not arrive as a single invention. It was not a sudden spark, but a soft accumulation of knowledge, seeds kept aside, roots dug and replanted, berries noticed for their sweetness or reliability. Over time, people observed which plants grew best, which times to sow, and which soils held the most promise. At first, they still hunted and gathered, as they always had. But gradually, planting became a pattern, a rhythm that returned each year. Fields were cleared, tools were sharpened, and the harvest began to mark the turning of the seasons. The earliest evidence of farming comes from the Fertile Crescent, a curving region stretching through parts of what is now Iraq, Syria, Turkey, and Iran. Here, wild grains such as barley and wheat grew in abundance, and people began to tend them. They used digging sticks and stone sickles, grinding stones and woven baskets. Over time, animals too were drawn into the circle of care. Goats, sheep, and later cattle were gradually domesticated. Their wildness softened through generations of shared life. These animals provided not only meat, but milk, wool, hides, and strength, companions in labor as well as in sustenance. With farming came the first true settlements, small villages of clay or stone, arranged around shared spaces, often near water. Homes were simple but sturdy, mud brick walls dried in the sun. Roofs were thatched or packed with earth. Inside, people slept, cooked, stored grain, and shaped tools. Outside, children played, elders taught, and the rhythm of the day unfolded in familiar ways. Smoke curled from hearths in the early morning. Grinding stones turned with quiet repetition. Animals stirred in pens, and the fields rustled softly with growth. These early villages were more than just places to live. They were places of memory, continuity, and care. Generations were born, raised, and buried in the same ground. People began to build not only for shelter, but for meaning. In some places, small shrines or sacred spaces emerged, rooms set aside for offerings, for ritual, for the unseen. Figurines were placed in corners, bones were arranged with care, patterns were painted on walls with ochre and lime. The spiritual life of these communities flowed through daily acts, through planting and harvest, birth and death, light and dark. The transition to farming was not without difficulty. It required new kinds of labor, tending crops, storing food, protecting fields. Diets changed, sometimes narrowing to fewer foods, and staying in one place meant new challenges: sanitation, disease, conflict. Yet the benefits were deep. With more stable food supplies, populations grew, skills diversified. Pottery appeared, shaped and fired to hold water, grain, or offerings. Weaving developed, as did more complex forms of trade and cooperation. Slowly, the structure of society began to shift. Elders held knowledge not only of story, but of planting times and ancestral lands. The seasons themselves became teachers, shaping lives with their quiet lessons. We can still feel this shift today, embedded in the words and rhythms of human life. The idea of home, of returning to a place and making it one's own, took root in these early villages. The idea of property, of tending and owning, of generations dwelling together in the same soil, all began here. Even the shape of time changed, no longer marked only by stars or migrations. It was now charted by planting, sprouting, ripening, harvesting. Time slowed, it deepened, it became cyclical, a turning wheel, rather than a straight path. Some of the earliest and most striking settlements from this era are found at sites like Çatalhöyük in modern-day Turkey. Here, over 9,000 years ago, people lived in densely packed homes with shared walls and rooftop entrances. There were no streets, only rooftops connected by ladders and walkways. Inside these homes, People painted walls with symbolic images, vultures, hands, animals. Burials took place beneath the floors. Daily life and spiritual practice were intertwined. There was no temple set apart. The sacred was present in the dwelling, in the act of living itself. As villages grew, so did the web of connection. Trade routes formed, carrying obsidian, shells, pigments, and stories across mountains and plains. These were not great empires, not yet, but threads of exchange, cooperation, and learning stretched across vast distances. The quiet revolution of farming was not just about food, it was about relationship, to the land, to each other, to the past and the future. And though the world was changing, some things remained. People still told stories, still sang songs, still watched the stars. They still remembered the places they had come from, the journeys their ancestors had taken, the wild lands beyond the cultivated fields. They honored the old ways, even as new ones emerged. In this way, the dawn of agriculture was not a break from the past, but a soft unfolding, a blending of movement and stillness, of wildness and tending, of memory and hope. And so from seed to root to harvest, the rhythms of life deepened. The land once passed through became a partner. And in this rootedness, humans found not only sustenance, but the beginnings of permanence, of culture, and of place. Ahead, with settled life growing stronger, people would begin to build not only villages, but something more complex, shared structures, public spaces, and the earliest hints of cities. As the seeds of agriculture sank deeper into the soil and generations returned to the same patches of earth, something new began to grow, not just crops, but connection. People who once lived in scattered clusters now began to cluster more intentionally. Villages became more than places to sleep and store food. They became places of gathering, places of exchange, places where the quiet pulse of human society began to take on new rhythms. Slowly and with care, the first communities emerged, soft structured and low to the ground, yet deeply woven with meaning. The earliest communities were shaped by needs both practical and spiritual. With more people living in one place, cooperation became essential. Paths were worn between homes, wells were dug, shared hearths were built, and spaces were set aside for meeting, celebration, and mourning. Labor was often collective, planting, harvesting, building, preparing. Hands worked side by side, and in the repetition of shared tasks, bonds were formed. Children played in the dust, imitating the work of their elders. Elders sat in the shade, offering stories, songs, and warnings born from memory. Within these small societies, rules and roles began to take form, not laws as we think of them, but customs, rhythms, expectations. Elders might settle disputes with words or memory of past agreements. Rituals marked transitions from childhood to adulthood, from season to season, from life to death. These ceremonies, simple or symbolic, stitched individuals into the fabric of the group. They were not grand performances but quiet affirmations. You are one of us. You belong here. Architecture began to reflect this sense of belonging. Homes were no longer built in isolation. They were clustered, aligned, shaped with awareness of their neighbors. Walls were shared, roof lines echoed each other. Materials were gathered collectively. Mud, straw, stone, and timber, shaped by many hands for many needs. And between the homes, open spaces emerged. Courtyards, plazas, or common hearths where people gathered to grind grain, to sing, to sit and speak as day turned softly to night. Some communities began to develop specialized roles: a skilled potter, a healer, a weaver of baskets or cloth, a keeper of stories. This was not yet hierarchy in its sharpest form, but rather a recognition of skill, of memory, of particular gifts. Each person mattered, not only as part of a group, but as a bearer of something unique. Trade grew, not just between individuals, but between communities. Obsidian, shells, pigments, woven goods, and sacred items passed from hand to hand, carried along quiet paths through forests and over ridges. These exchanges were not merely economic, They were relational. To give and to receive was to trust, to connect. With this expansion of exchange came new materials, especially pottery, one of the most quietly revolutionary developments in human life. Clay, shaped and hardened by fire, offered a way to store, carry, and preserve. Pots could hold water, grain, oil, or cooked food. But they also became canvases. Decorations were etched, painted, or pressed into the wet clay, lines, patterns, sometimes even images. These motifs were not just decorative, they marked identity, region, perhaps even belief. A shared design told of a shared people. Burial practices also deepened. In many communities, the dead were no longer simply placed in the earth. They were buried beneath homes, in courtyards, or in special places set aside for remembrance. Bodies were sometimes arranged with care, accompanied by objects, beads, tools, or offerings of food. These practices speak of more than grief. They speak of continuity, of a belief that the ancestors remained present, watching, guiding, remembered in every step. It was part of daily life. As these settlements expanded, some began to grow larger than ever before. Jericho, in the Jordan Valley, rose as one of the world's oldest known towns, surrounded by a massive stone wall and a circular tower, both built over 10,000 years ago. Why the wall was built is still debated. Was it for defense, for ritual, for memory? We may never know, but what it tells us is clear, that people had begun to think in broader terms, not only of homes, but of place. Not only of shelter, but of structure. And with structure came new forms of expression. Walls were painted, floors were decorated with plaster and pigments. Symbols were carved into stone. These were not grand monuments, not yet, but they were beginnings. Expressions of pride, of belief, of belonging. They told the story of a people who saw themselves not only as individuals or families, but as something larger, a community held together by shared memory, shared labor, and shared place. In such spaces, music may have flourished. Flutes, made from bone, drums from stretched hide, rattles from seeds or clay, the sounds of daily life were woven with song. Rhythm helped guide labor, mark rituals, soothe children. Dance too may have emerged, the body as an instrument, the group as a moving whole. These expressions weren't separate from life. They were part of it, inseparable from the work of tending the hearth or grinding the grain. In this way, the first communities grew, not through conquest, but through cooperation. Not through wealth, but through warmth. They were shaped by the turning of the seasons, the pulse of the earth, and the shared breath of those who lived close together, side by side. And as these small societies grew stronger, more stable, and more complex, they laid the foundation for what would come next, the quiet rise of cities, not just clusters of homes, but organized places of memory, movement, belief, and exchange. As the slow centuries passed, the villages that once clung to riversides and hillsides began to grow, not just in size, but in structure, in complexity, and in meaning. Life that was once woven loosely around seasonal rhythms began to gather itself more tightly. Roads became more worn, spaces more defined. The web of human connection thickened until something quietly revolutionary emerged. The first cities. The earliest of these cities rose not with fanfare but with continuity, an extension of what came before. In the fertile plains between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, in a region now known as Mesopotamia, the soil was rich, the water abundant, and the seasons, though harsh, could be harnessed through careful labor. It was here, in what some call the cradle of civilization, that cities such as Eridu and Uruk began to take shape, sun-dried, mud brick by mud brick, beneath skies filled with dust and possibility. Eridu, often named as the very first city, began as a simple settlement near a flowing source of fresh water. Over generations, it expanded into a layered mound, what archaeologists call a tell, a place where newer structures rose atop older ones, the past always just beneath the feet of the present. At Eridu's heart stood a temple, small at first, then rebuilt many times, growing grander with each generation. This wasn't just a place of worship, it was a center of gathering, of trade, of ritual. In its design we see something new, a collective focus, a shared identity shaped around belief and space. Not far from Eridu, the city of Uruk blossomed, becoming by 3000 BCE the largest city in the world. Its population may have reached tens of thousands, an astonishing concentration of people in a time when most humans still lived in small, scattered communities. Within its broad walls lay narrow alleyways, open courtyards, bustling workshops, and monumental temples. Towering above the flat plain was the Inanna district, home to a massive temple complex dedicated to Inanna, the goddess of love and war. Here we see the early threads of organized religion, governance, and urban planning, not imposed suddenly, but developed softly over generations. In cities like Uruk, life changed not just in scale, but in texture. Specialization became essential. No longer did every household need to produce its own tools or grow all its own food. Farmers, craftsmen, potters, herders, and scribes each contributed their skill. The economy, once rooted in barter, began to require records, and with that need, the first writing systems were born. On small clay tablets, scribes pressed symbols with a reed stylus, tracking grain deliveries, land agreements, and ritual offerings. This early form of cuneiform was not literature. It was bookkeeping, the quiet birth of writing not as art, but as memory made durable. Urban life brought new challenges. With more people came new pressures, sanitation, food distribution, defense, but it also brought new possibilities. People who once may never have met now exchanged ideas, materials, and customs. Marketplaces grew, public festivals were held. The city became a place not only of labor, but of encounter. A weaver might learn a new pattern from a traveler. A child might hear stories from a far-off village. A builder might carve a new design into a wall, inspired by something seen on a passing merchant's pack. And yet, despite its growing complexity, the city remained human in scale. Homes were built close together, clustered around courtyards where neighbors shared meals and gossip. Clay ovens warmed the air with the scent of bread. Looms clacked softly in the shade. Water was drawn from wells, carried in jars balanced on hips. Children ran along the same packed earth streets their grandparents had once walked, threading between donkeys and carts, playing in the dust. Temples and palaces did rise, symbols of growing power and organization, but they did not yet dominate every life. Authority was still local, personal, negotiated. Kings were more stewards than rulers, their strength bound to their ability to manage water, to keep peace, to honor the gods. The divine and the earthly were not separate. In rituals and offerings, people sought to maintain harmony, not control nature, but live alongside it with respect and gratitude. Art continued to flourish in quiet ways. Cylinder seals, small carved stones rolled onto wet clay, served as signatures, identifiers, and tiny works of beauty. Pottery became more refined. Sculpture, while still symbolic and stylized, began to explore new forms. The human figure, once abstract, now showed signs of individuality. Eyes widened, hands clasped, postures hinted at emotion. These changes were subtle, but they spoke of a growing interest in the person, the self, the story within the community. Perhaps most importantly, cities like Uruk and Eridu held memory. They anchored people not only in space, but in time. To live in such a place was to know that one walked among the layers of the past. Foundations were built atop ruins. Walls incorporated fragments of older homes. Names and traditions were passed down, generation after generation. In this way, the city became more than a place to live. It became a story, one told in brick and bone, in clay and fire, in the soft tread of feet across long-worn paths. And so the ancient urban dream unfolded, not in towering monuments, but in the slow accumulation of lives lived side by side. A shared space, a shared future, a shared memory made durable. From this foundation, civilization would continue to rise, slowly, unevenly, and with quiet power. Ahead lay the shaping of rule and law, the weaving of myth into society, and the delicate balance between order and freedom. As the first cities grew, as walls rose and streets took form, a new kind of structure began to settle across human life, not made of stone or clay, but of story, symbol, and shared belief. The world was vast and often unpredictable. Floods came without warning. Storms swept across the plains. The sun's rising and setting, the phases of the moon, the sudden illness of a child, or the success of a harvest, all of these stirred questions in early minds. And slowly, with care and reverence, people began to seek patterns in the sky and meaning in the earth. They began to see the world not only as a place of survival, but as a web of unseen forces, powerful, mysterious, sometimes benevolent, sometimes fearsome. In this atmosphere of wonder and uncertainty, temples rose as more than just places of worship. They became the axis of the city, not just physically, but spiritually. Their steps reached upward, toward the heavens. Their altars bore offerings of food, oil, incense, and prayer. In Mesopotamia, the ziggurat became the dominant temple form, a stepped, terraced structure rising from the flat earth like a mountain built by human hands. These were not open spaces like modern temples, but tiered platforms, each level reaching closer to the sky. At the top, a shrine, modest but sacred, held the image or presence of a god. Only priests could enter, tending to the needs of the divine, interpreting dreams, reading signs in the stars or in the entrails of animals. To the people, the gods were not distant abstractions. They were active presences, embedded in nature, in weather, in fate. Each city had its patron deity. Inanna in Uruk, Enki in Eridu, Marduk in Babylon. The temple was not only their house, but their seat of power, their place of rest. The relationship between humans and gods was built on offering and obligation. When the people fulfilled their duties, with rituals, sacrifices, and obedience, the gods would bless them with rain, fertility, and peace. But when the gods were angered, when temples were neglected or oaths broken, misfortune followed. This belief was not driven by fear alone. It offered order, it made sense of chaos. Alongside the priests, another figure began to rise, one who stood between heaven and earth, not in robes but in rule, the king. The first kings were not absolute rulers, but chosen leaders, often drawn from among the elders or warriors of the community. Over time, their role became more formal, their power more lasting. In many cities, kings claimed a divine mandate, not that they were gods themselves, but that their rule was sanctioned by the gods. They became the guardians of the sacred order, responsible not only for law and defense, but for harmony with the heavens. In Mesopotamian cities, kings would often sponsor grand building projects, temples, walls, canals. These were not only practical improvements, they were acts of devotion, signs of favor, offerings made visible in stone and labor. In some cases, rulers left behind inscriptions, carved on stelae or pressed into clay, listing their achievements, praising the gods, cursing anyone who would undo their work. These texts were not written for the present alone. They were addressed to the future, to posterity, to the eternal gaze of the divine. This intertwining of religion and rule brought new systems into being. Laws were codified, sometimes literally carved into stone. The famous Code of Hammurabi, created in Babylon nearly 4,000 years ago, listed penalties and procedures for everything from theft to marriage. It opened with a declaration from the gods and ended with blessings for those who honored it, curses for those who defied it. Such texts were not simply legal, they were sacred documents, shaped by the belief that justice itself was a divine gift, that the cosmos had order and human life must mirror it. The role of the temple also expanded. It became a center not only of ritual, but of storage and distribution. Grain was collected and redistributed through temple granaries. Livestock, labor, and even land could be managed through priestly records. In this way, the temple became both spiritual and economic, a symbol of abundance, stability, and connection between people and the land. And within this structure, festivals brought life. The calendar, once tied to the cycles of crops and moonlight, became a rhythm of celebration. In spring, planting was marked with dances and feasts. In midsummer, offerings were made for rain. In the fall, harvest festivals echoed with music and song. People gathered in open courtyards, wearing garlands, beating drums, sharing meals. These were not merely rituals, they were affirmations that the world had pattern, that people belonged, that life, though fragile, was part of something vast. Even within the home, spiritual life continued. Small altars were built in corners. Figurines of household gods were kept beside the hearth. Incense was burned. Prayers were whispered. Protection was sought not only from great temples, but from ancestors, spirits, and the quiet forces that moved unseen through daily life. As cities grew, as kings ruled, and as priests tended the sacred flame, this deep structure of order took root. People no longer lived only by instinct or custom. They lived within systems of belief, of duty, of ritual and record. Life became more layered, more observed, more remembered, and through it all the stars still turned. The sun still rose over flat plains, and the people, now gathered in cities with walls and temples, still looked upward in awe, reading the sky not just for weather, but for meaning. In time, this growing web of belief, governance, and memory would give rise to civilizations more vast, to empires that stretched beyond rivers and valleys, connected by roads and ruled by distant kings. But before we reach those high places of power, we pause at the river's edge, where reeds bend in the breeze, and a new kind of life begins to flourish. Civilizations do not rise all at once. They gather slowly, like the swelling of a stream after winter thaw, fed by centuries of memory, need, and knowledge. And just as people had always followed water, so too did civilization take root beside it, drawn to the banks of great rivers that pulsed with life. In the long arc of human history, few forces shaped the world as gently and profoundly as these rivers. They fed the land, carried goods and people, marked time through their floods, and offered a rhythm to human life that echoed far beyond their shores. The Nile, the Indus, and the Yellow River, each in its own way, gave rise to some of the earliest complex societies. Though far apart in geography, they shared something deeper, a partnership with water, with land, and with the slow passage of time. Along the Nile, in northeastern Africa, the river flowed from the heart of the continent to the Mediterranean Sea. It was not a single stream, but a ribbon of green threading through golden desert. Every year, like breath itself, the Nile would rise and overflow its banks, leaving behind dark, silty soil rich with nutrients. This rhythm was as old as the land. For those who lived by the river, the flood was not disaster, it was life. It meant planting, harvest, and plenty. It was celebrated in prayers and honored with offerings. Here ancient Egypt blossomed, not as a single city, but as a chain of settlements stretched along the river's course. The landscape shaped the culture. Narrow bands of farmland hugged the water, hemmed in by desert on both sides. Communication and trade flowed along the Nile like a great, slow-moving road. Boats made of reeds or planks glided over its surface, carrying grain, fish, stone, and song. Life turned with the river, not in haste, but in harmony. In the Nile Valley, architecture rose with purpose. Mud brick homes, cool and shaded, lined the banks, temples opened toward the water. And in time, great stone monuments, pyramids, and obelisks reached skyward, built with astonishing care and endurance. These were not just tombs or markers, they were statements of belief that order could be built, that memory could endure, that death was not an end, but a passage. Far to the east, In what is now Pakistan and northwest India, another great river cradled a civilization, the Indus. This river, with its broad shifting course, nourished a vast region of plains and forests. Here by 2500 BCE, cities like Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro had risen, carefully planned, with grid-like streets, drainage systems, public baths, and granaries. The people of the Indus Valley built in brick, not stone, and their cities suggest not only practical knowledge, but a respect for balance and order. What is striking about the Indus civilization is its quiet dignity. There is little evidence of grand palaces or towering temples. No statues of kings, no lavish tombs. Instead, we find standardization in brick size, weights, and measures, and a sense of civic unity. The cities appear clean, harmonious, and thoughtfully arranged. Seals pressed into soft clay show animals, trees, and a still undeciphered script, symbols of a culture that communicated not through conquest, but through craft. Like the Nile, the Indus shaped every part of life. It brought water for crops, allowed for movement of goods, and grounded the rhythm of the seasons. And when it flooded, as it sometimes did with force, the people adapted, rebuilding, reshaping, continuing. Further still, in the vast lands of northern China, another great river wound its way through valleys and plains, the Huanghe, or Yellow River. Named for the low soil it carried, fine, golden dust from the highlands, the Yellow River was both a gift and a danger. Its floods could be devastating, reshaping the land, erasing entire settlements. And yet its waters were essential. Along its banks, millet was cultivated. Later, rice spread in the south, animals were domesticated. Pottery and silk production began. And out of this fertile crescent of Eastern Asia, early Chinese culture began to form. The villages of the Yellow River grew into larger centers. By the time of the Shang dynasty, around 1600 BCE, a recognizable state had taken form, with bronze casting, writing, ancestor worship, and fortified cities. Oracle bones etched with symbols and cracked by fire were used to ask questions of the spirits. In their characters, we see the roots of the Chinese script, enduring, evolving, still with us today. Each of these river civilizations developed differently. Egypt built monuments to eternity. The Indus laid out cities with quiet precision. China listened to the spirits in the cracks of bone and the swirls of silk, but all three were shaped by water, by soil, by the subtle logic of seasonal flow. The rivers were not just resources, they were companions, teachers, mirrors of time. These civilizations left their mark not only in objects, but in ideas, in how people saw the world and their place within it. They taught that life could be ordered, that nature could be observed, that the heavens had patterns. They created systems of writing, mathematics, and governance that would echo through the ages. And though each eventually changed, declined, or transformed, the rivers remained, flowing still, whispering the memories of those who once built, prayed, and lived along their banks. And so, from rivers to fields, from reed boats to carved stone, the great current of civilization continued. Ahead, new ideas would rise, about power, about justice, about the stories that shape identity. In the ancient cities of lawgivers and philosophers, a new kind of voice would begin to emerge. For countless generations, human memory lived in the air, carried in the breath of elders, passed from voice to voice, remembered in stories, prayers, songs, and shared experience. Knowledge was not stored, but lived. It traveled with people, echoing through cave walls, whispered beside fires, and embedded in the patterns of ritual. But as communities grew and cities became more intricate, the world required something more permanent, a way to capture the spoken word, to fix it in place, to carry meaning across time and space. And so, slowly and with great care, writing was born. The first known systems of writing did not begin as literature or poetry. They began with lists, inventories, receipts, records of trade and tribute. In ancient Mesopotamia, Where the city of Uruk had grown into a center of commerce and ritual, scribes began pressing marks into soft clay. Using a reed stylus, they created wedge-shaped impressions, cuneiform, which could be read, counted, and stored. At first, each symbol stood for a thing: grain, sheep, silver, wine. Over time, the symbols became more abstract. They could represent sounds, syllables, ideas. This shift was quiet but profound. It allowed writing to move beyond the visible world, to capture thought, story, and law. Cuneiform tablets were small, easily carried, and baked to last. Thousands have survived, tucked away in ancient archives, scattered through ruins, buried for millennia. Some are administrative, ledgers of laborers, shipments, and temple offerings. Others contain contracts, hymns, medical advice, or even student exercises, evidence of scribes in training, practicing the shapes that would one day hold empires together. In Egypt, writing took a different form. The hieroglyph, a more pictorial system, emerged alongside the rise of the Old Kingdom. Here, the script flowed with grace: birds, eyes, water ripples, and ankhs, arranged in columns or rows, often carved or painted with meticulous care. Hieroglyphs adorned temple walls and tombs, telling stories of kings, gods, and journeys into the afterlife. But they were not only decorative, they were believed to hold power. To name something was to call it into being. To write it down was to preserve it, not only for the living, but for eternity. The Egyptians also developed more fluid forms of writing: hieratic and later demotic, used for daily life, letters, and ledgers. On sheets of papyrus, these scripts moved with speed and ease. Words could now be carried, copied, and archived. Temples maintained scriptoria, where scribes wrote, translated, and kept the histories of kings, rituals, and sacred thought. In the Indus Valley, a script also appeared, etched onto seals, pottery, and tablets. Though it remains undeciphered, its symbols are striking, intricate, balanced, often accompanied by images of animals or abstract forms. Its purpose is still unknown, perhaps administrative, perhaps religious, perhaps something in between. What remains is a quiet mystery, a voice just beyond our hearing, still waiting to be understood. In China, by the time of the Shang dynasty, writing was already well developed. Oracle bones, shoulder blades of oxen or turtle shells, were inscribed with questions to the ancestors and the spirits. These inscriptions, carved with a fine tool and later inked for clarity, represent some of the earliest known Chinese characters. Unlike other scripts that vanished or evolved into unreadable forms, the Chinese writing system maintained continuity, gradually transforming into the characters still used today. To write in this culture was to honor the past, to consult the divine, and to create a bridge between heaven, earth, and human will. The birth of writing was not uniform. In Mesoamerica, a world away, the Olmecs and later the Maya developed glyphic systems independent of Old World scripts. The Maya especially recorded histories, rituals, and astronomical cycles with exquisite care, carved into stone stelae, painted in codices, inscribed in jade and shell. Their writing, once misunderstood, is now slowly unfolding, revealing stories of dynasties, wars, and cosmic order. Wherever it appeared, writing changed the world in quiet ways. It allowed memory to stretch beyond the limits of one generation. It preserved knowledge with new precision. It created classes of scribes, keepers of records, interpreters of law, writers of sacred text. It brought with it new responsibilities, to truth, to tradition, to the power of the written word. But writing was never only practical. It was also poetic. The first epics, long winding stories of gods and heroes, were eventually committed to clay and ink. The Epic of Gilgamesh, born in the cities of Mesopotamia, speaks of friendship, mortality, and the search for meaning. It was written and rewritten over centuries, its verses echoing through libraries and palaces, read aloud by candlelight, remembered by hearts even when tablets were broken. In Egypt, the Book of the Dead gathered spells and prayers for the soul's journey beyond life, a guidebook to the afterworld's hidden paths. In India, the Vedas were first spoken, sung from memory for generations, and later written down, becoming anchors of a growing spiritual tradition. In China, texts of philosophy and ritual were copied and preserved, their calligraphy itself an art, their content shaping dynasties. With writing, history began to take form, not only as archaeology, but as narrative. Dates, names, lineages, laws. And with history came legacy, the sense that one's actions might be remembered, that one's words might last. And so, the world changed, gently, gradually, and profoundly. The voice that once faded with dusk could now endure. The memory that once rested in a single mind could be shared across generations. The spoken became the inscribed, the fleeting became the lasting. And as writing spread, it would shape every age to come, preserving wisdom, recording conflict, praising gods, and reflecting the quiet wonders of the human heart. Ahead, through the written word and the cities that embraced it, power would grow, in temples, in palaces, and on battlefields. But before the clash of empires, we pause for another story, that of the everyday people whose hands shaped these worlds from the ground up. No longer limited to single river valleys or regional centers, some societies began to expand, softly at first, then more boldly, stretching their influence across broad plains, over hills, and into neighboring territories. What emerged was the shape of empire, a web of roads, trade, laws, and alliances held together by the idea, and often the illusion, of centralized power. And yet, empires were not only built on conquest or might, they were built on the enduring rhythms of labor, on the trust carried in caravans, and on the belief that many peoples could be held, however briefly, within a single shared story. In Mesopotamia, the city-states that once stood alone began to coalesce under stronger leaders. Sargon of Akkad, often named the first empire builder, united a patchwork of cities around 2300 BCE. His rule extended from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean coast, not just in terms of land, but in language, law, and trade. The Akkadian Empire, though it rose and fell within a few generations, set a pattern that would echo through the centuries: a central ruler, provincial governors, taxes collected in grain and silver, armies raised and maintained, and messages carved into stone for the ages. Other empires followed, each adding its own layer. The Babylonians codified law and celestial observation. The Assyrians built roads and record-keeping systems, as well as fearsome armies that moved swiftly with iron weapons and chariots. And the Persians, centuries later, created perhaps one of the most expansive and gentle forms of rule, linking lands from India to Greece, respecting local customs, and connecting distant peoples through shared infrastructure. Their royal road, stretching over 1,000 miles, allowed messengers to cross the empire in a matter of days, a feat that astonished later civilizations. In Egypt, empire was more contained, but no less powerful. The pharaohs ruled not just as kings, but as divine figures, human embodiments of cosmic balance. Their control extended up and down the Nile, their wealth measured in gold, grain, and labor. Great building projects, temples, tombs, obelisks, employed thousands. Their borders were marked not just by walls, but by diplomacy, trade, and occasional conquest into Nubia and the Levant. Yet the rhythm of Egyptian life remained deeply rooted in the cycles of the river, slow, steady, and ceremonial. Further east, the Hittites and Mitanni rose in Anatolia, forming complex treaties and building with stone and fire. In the Indus Valley, the Harappan civilization declined, and new Vedic cultures emerged, with shifting centers of power, fluid borders, and oral traditions that carried their beliefs and laws through song and verse rather than stone. And in China, the Zhou dynasty introduced the idea of the mandate of heaven, that rulers governed not by birth alone, but by moral order, a belief that would shape Chinese political thought for millennia. What linked these empires was not only power, but movement. Roads, simple at first, then paved or marked, allowed people, goods, and ideas to flow. Caravans carried spices, wool, ivory, lapis lazuli, copper, and tin. Donkeys and camels walked dusty trails. Boats followed rivers and coasts. Along these paths moved more than cargo. Language spread. Technology moved. Beliefs intertwined. Even diseases and migrations wove their way through these networks, changing the shape of the human map again and again. Infrastructure became the quiet backbone of empires. Irrigation channels turned dry soil into farmland. Dams controlled seasonal floods. Storage facilities, way stations, and rest stops dotted the landscape. Bureaucrats counted and recorded. Soldiers patrolled. Diplomats negotiated. And in every corner, local traditions blended with imperial policies, creating a patchwork that was never uniform, but always adaptive. Still, beneath the grandeur, the everyday continued. Farmers plowed, potters shaped, merchants weighed goods on carved balances. Cities remained centers of production, as well as administration. Neighborhoods bustled with speech, laughter, and the daily chores of life. In markets, one could hear multiple languages, see distant fashions, and taste foods that had traveled far from their origin. The empire lived not only in palaces, but in stalls, workshops, and roadside inns. Writing, too, evolved within these systems. It became more formalized, used not just to record goods, but to issue royal decrees, maintain census rolls, and preserve treaties. Schools for scribes were established, and libraries slowly emerged, places where tablets and scrolls could be stored, read, and copied. Knowledge was no longer only local, it could be transmitted, preserved, and eventually rediscovered. And yet, even the most powerful empires faced fragility. Climate shifts, internal unrest, external invasion, all could tip the balance, and often it was the roads that foretold the decline. Trade slowed, borders frayed, governors acted independently. Still, even as empires faded, the roads remained, literal and cultural paths that future peoples would follow, repair, and reshape. What the great empires left behind was not only architecture or artifacts, they left ideas about how to govern, how to organize, how to connect. They left languages that would evolve into many tongues and laws that would echo in later courts. They left maps drawn not on paper, but in memory, the sense that human life could stretch across vast spaces, linked not by sameness, but by shared systems. And through it all, the pulse of daily life endured, the farmer harvesting grain under imperial tax, the artisan crafting pottery for a market square, the mother rocking her child in a courtyard, lit by lamplight. These quiet acts of living gave the empire its breath. In time, these imperial networks would become the setting for some of humanity's most enduring philosophies, questions not just about rule and order, but about the self, the soul, and the nature of the good life. From the streets of Athens to the forests of India, a new era of thought was dawning. As empires spread and cities grew, as roads stretched across mountains and deserts, a new kind of space quietly opened, not just physical, but mental. For centuries, humans had shaped the land, recorded the heavens, built systems of governance, and organized belief. But now, in several corners of the world, people began to turn inward. They began to ask, what is the good life? What is justice? What does it mean to know, to feel, to be? These were not questions of administration or trade, but of the human spirit. And from them emerged the slow flowering of philosophy, not as a formal discipline at first, but as an unfolding conversation across time, place, and culture. In ancient India, as the Vedic traditions deepened and transformed, sages withdrew into forests and mountains, seeking not wealth or rule, but inner clarity. These forest dwellers, or rishis, composed meditative texts known as the Upanishads, reflections on the self-Atman, the universe Brahman, and the threads that bound all things. They asked, what lies beyond the senses? Is the soul eternal? Can one be liberated from the cycle of birth and death? Their answers were not simple, nor always the same, but they were offered in calm, in stillness, in contemplation. From this soil, the roots of Hindu philosophy would grow, and later, the gentle revolutions of Buddhism and Jainism would blossom, offering new paths toward compassion, detachment, and nonviolence. In China, around the same time, roughly the 6th century BCE, another great wave of thought stirred. The Zhou dynasty, once a symbol of harmony, had begun to fracture. In the face of disorder, thinkers sought not escape, but restoration. Confucius, born in modest circumstances, wandered from court to court, sharing his vision of a society guided by Li ritual, Ren benevolence, and respect for family and tradition. He believed that virtue, not force, held the key to good governance. His teachings, recorded by students, would shape Chinese ethics for over 2,000 years, influencing rulers, scholars, and ordinary people alike. But Confucius was not alone. In the same landscape, Laozi, a more elusive figure, offered a different path through the Tao Te Ching, a text of sparse poetic wisdom. Where Confucius sought order through structure, Laozi sought peace through surrender, urging alignment with the Tao, the unnameable way of nature. Be like water, the Taoist sage would say. Yield, flow, nourish without striving. This philosophy did not oppose action, but questioned ambition. It invited stillness, humility, and trust in the quiet balance of all things. In the Mediterranean world, too, a new spirit of inquiry emerged. In the bustling city of Athens, among olive trees and crowded marketplaces, teachers and thinkers began to gather. The earliest of them, sometimes called the pre-Socratics, wondered about the stuff of the universe. Was it water, fire, air, or something unseen? They sought patterns in nature, causes beyond myth, beginnings that could be reasoned rather than remembered. Then came Socrates, a figure whose life would become legend, though he left no writings of his own. Wandering the streets in simple clothes, he questioned everyone he met. What is justice? What is courage? What do we mean when we say we know? His method was not to lecture, but to ask, to guide others into deeper thought through dialogue. His refusal to flatter power and his commitment to truth led to his death by poison, a martyr not for a religion, but for reason. His student Plato took those conversations and shaped them into dialogues, rich with character, argument, and philosophy. He imagined the world as shadows and forms, a place where truth existed beyond the senses. His academy became one of the first great centers of learning in the Western world. And from his teachings came Aristotle, who turned his gaze outward, studying logic, biology, ethics, politics, poetry. For Aristotle, wisdom came from close observation, clear thinking, and the disciplined shaping of the self toward virtue. These ancient thinkers were not all alike. They disagreed, debated, and diverged. Some lived in courts, others in forests. Some wrote long treatises, others short verses or cryptic aphorisms. But what united them was not belief, but a way of asking, a willingness to wonder, to challenge, to sit with uncertainty. Their words, once whispered or spoken under trees and colonnades, were slowly written down, copied, and preserved. They were carried along the same roads as merchants and messengers, tucked into scrolls beside epics and laws. Over time, they became foundations for education, for religion, for how societies shape themselves. But perhaps their greatest legacy is not the answers they gave, but the posture they held, one of openness, of seeking, of humility before the vastness of life. They did not demand certainty. They invited reflection. They did not build walls. They opened paths. And as empires continued to rise and fall, as temples crumbled and new gods were named, the quiet voice of the philosopher remained, asking, listening, and reminding each generation that wisdom does not shout. It waits, it watches, it walks beside us in the quiet spaces of thought. Ahead, those ideas would meet power once more, woven into empires, carried by conquerors, translated into law, and stitched into sacred text. But for now, in the hush before expansion, we pause to feel the deep breath of the human mind, curious, restless, and beautifully aware. As human civilizations deepened and spread, belief became more than local practice or seasonal rite. It began to reach across boundaries, to gather people from distant lands into shared rhythms of worship, ethics, and story. The world's first great religions did not appear suddenly. They unfolded over centuries, emerging from earlier rituals, shaped by wandering teachers, crystallized in sacred texts, and carried forward by pilgrims, poets, and priests. These faiths crossed rivers and mountains, not by force alone, but by invitation, offering not only gods to worship, but ways to live, to die, to belong. In India, long after the earliest Vedic hymns had been sung beside sacrificial fires, a new path began to take shape, one that turned inward, seeking peace not through offering alone, but through stillness, renunciation, and compassion. Around the 6th century BCE, Siddhartha Gautama, later known as the Buddha, walked away from his princely life to sit beneath a Bodhi tree, where he touched the earth and awoke to a new understanding of suffering, desire, and release. His teachings, simple in form yet vast in implication, became the heart of Buddhism, a gentle path toward freedom from suffering, through right thought, right action, and mindful awareness. Buddhism spread not through conquest, but through community. Monks and nuns traveled on foot, carrying only robes and bowls. They shared stories, taught practices, and accepted offerings in exchange for wisdom. Pilgrims followed their paths, visiting sacred sites, Lumbini, where the Buddha was born, Bodh Gaya, where he awakened, Sarnath, where he first taught, and Kushinagar, where he passed into final peace. These journeys were not only outward, they were meditations in motion, steps taken in devotion, in remembrance, in humility. Around the same time, another faith arose in India, Jainism, shaped by the teachings of Mahavira, a contemporary of the Buddha. Jainism emphasized nonviolence to all living things, not only in deed, but in thought and intention. Its followers practiced asceticism, restraint, and deep reverence for life in all its forms. Though smaller in number, Jain communities contributed richly to India's ethical and spiritual landscape, building temples of carved marble, practicing strict compassion, and preserving texts through centuries of careful copying. Further west, in the deserts of the Near East, another vision of sacred life took form. The Hebrews, descendants of ancient pastoral tribes, carried with them a memory of covenant, an agreement between their people, and a single, unseen God. Their story, later written in the Hebrew Bible, told of exile and return, law and mercy, struggle and promise. From this lineage, Judaism emerged, a religion not focused on place or power, but on memory, study, and ethical living. Its rituals revolved around the Sabbath, festivals tied to the land and to history, and the reading of sacred text. The synagogue became a center of learning, prayer, and community. The Torah, passed from hand to hand, from generation to generation, was not only scripture, it was a path. In Persia, the prophet Zoroaster, or Zarathustra, offered yet another vision. He taught of a cosmic struggle between truth and falsehood, between light and darkness. At the center stood Ahura Mazda, the wise Lord, and the call to live a life of righteousness, good words, and good deeds. Zoroastrianism became the guiding faith of the Persian Empire for centuries, its fire temples glowing with eternal flames, its prayers whispered at dawn and dusk, its rituals honoring both material and spiritual purity. These early faiths shared something subtle, a sense that life had meaning beyond the visible, that suffering could be eased, that the sacred could be known, not only through ritual, but through right action, ethical choice, and mindful living. In China, religious life remained a blend, woven from strands of Confucian tradition, Taoist mysticism, and local ancestral worship. Altars in the home honored the dead. Temples nestled in forests honored the spirits of mountains, rivers, and sky. Harmony, not hierarchy, guided the spiritual world. The divine was not always named, but it was felt, in the turning of seasons, in the rustle of wind through bamboo, in the quiet act of reverence before a stone or flame. As these religions spread, so too did the idea of pilgrimage, of leaving one's home not for trade or war, but to walk toward the sacred. Pilgrimage was a journey of both body and spirit. It required sacrifice, preparation, and faith. Along ancient roads, pilgrims sang hymns, carried tokens, lit incense. They traveled alone or in groups, sleeping under stars, guided by memory and hope. Some walked to places where teachers had taught. Others sought blessings, healing, or insight. But all walked in the knowledge that the road itself could transform. Sacred sites became gathering points, shrines carved into cliffs, springs set to heal, trees set to speak, hills where visions once occurred. These were not just destinations, they were touchstones, places where heaven felt close, where stories and silence met. And as these faiths matured, their teachings began to be written, preserved on palm leaves, parchment, clay, and silk. The Buddhist sutras, the Vedas and Upanishads, the Torah, the Gathas of Zoroaster, the early Taoist texts, each offered a path through life's mystery. These were not books to be read quickly, but texts to be studied, sung, memorized, and returned to again and again. They were carried by travelers, guarded by scribes, and passed down with care. Religion in the ancient world was not separate from life. It was life. It shaped the calendar, the household, the market, the court. It governed what was eaten, when rest was taken, how children were named, how the dead were mourned. It offered consolation in grief, purpose in work, and joy in celebration. And though empires would rise and fall, though borders shifted and cities were lost to time, these roads of faith endured. They stretched across mountains and deserts, through language and silence. They carried not only belief, but beauty, music, art, compassion, and the enduring hope that somewhere, in the great woven fabric of existence, one might find peace. Ahead, that same faith, now carried into new regions and spoken in new tongues, would continue to shape the world's great civilizations. But before we return to those sweeping vistas, we pause once more to listen, not to kings or sages, but to the ordinary voices of belief, the mother lighting a candle, the elder chanting a morning verse, the pilgrim tying a ribbon to a sacred tree. Far from the great rivers and deserts of the ancient world, beyond the clamor of temples and the murmur of marketplaces, stretched an ocean, wide, deep, and seemingly endless. The Pacific, with its rolling tides and boundless horizon, might have seemed a barrier to some. But for the ancient navigators of Oceania, it was a highway, a lifeline, a world of possibility. Here on water rather than land, humans charted one of the most remarkable journeys in our species' quiet history, a story not of conquest, but of movement, memory, and trust in the unseen path ahead. Thousands of years ago, long before compasses or maps, people began to leave the shores of Southeast Asia in canoes, carved from trees and lashed together with rope made from coconut fiber. These were not simple vessels. They were carefully constructed, double-hulled, balanced, and agile, designed to ride the swells, catch the wind, and carry families, animals, plants, tools, and memory across vast distances of open sea. Guided by experience, stars, and the feel of currents and birds, these voyagers set out into the unknown. At first they reached nearby islands, the Philippines, then Indonesia, and gradually out toward Melanesia to places like New Guinea, the Solomon Islands, and Vanuatu. These early settlements, now over 3,000 years old, were not mere landings. They were new homes, rooted in local resources, shaped by the unique landscapes and the spirits believed to reside in each rock, tree, and tide. But the journey did not stop. Over generations, and with astonishing precision, voyagers pushed further east, out into the heart of the Pacific. They reached Fiji, Tonga, and Samoa, and from there even farther, to the distant shores of the Marquesas, the Society Islands, and eventually to Tahiti, Hawaii, Rapa Nui, Easter Island, and New Zealand. This expansion, known as the Austronesian Migration, may be the greatest maritime feat of the ancient world. It was not done in haste. It was patient, careful, and deeply informed, guided by stars, swells, bird flight, cloud patterns, and the quiet language of the sea. Navigation was an art and a science, taught orally, preserved in chants, and passed from master to apprentice. A skilled navigator could feel the changing rhythm of the ocean beneath the canoe and know the direction of land far beyond sight. They could read the sky for signs, the angle of a constellation, the color of the water, the shape of waves. This knowledge, invisible to the untrained eye, was carried in memory and practice, not written on scrolls, but held within the navigator's mind like a living map. Life on the islands was shaped by cooperation and attentiveness. Each environment was unique: volcanic peaks, coral atolls, dense forests, or sandy coasts. But everywhere survival required harmony with nature. Crops such as taro, yams, bananas, breadfruit, and coconut were cultivated in carefully managed plots. Chickens, pigs, and dogs were raised. Fish and shellfish were gathered from reef and tide pool. Tools were made from bone, shell, and wood. Clothing was woven from plant fibers, softened by water, decorated with dye, pattern, and care. Houses were simple, open to the breeze, and raised on platforms to protect from rain. Roofs were thatched with palm or pandanus leaves. Communities were small, often organized around extended families and led by elders or chiefs, but their size did not limit their richness. Rituals marked every part of life: birth, naming, first catch, marriage, harvest, death. Music and dance were woven into these events, with drums, flutes, and singing drawing people together beneath the moon or the morning sun. Stories held the world together. Without writing, memory was sacred. Myths explained the birth of islands, the paths of ancestors, the origin of stars. Some stories were whispered, others chanted aloud for hours in ceremonial gatherings. The mana, or spiritual power of each person, place, or object was respected. The ocean itself was alive, not a void, but a living being, to be crossed with humility and awe. The voyaging canoes were symbols of more than travel. They were extensions of the self, of community, of legacy. To build a canoe was to gather many: carvers, lashers, priests, apprentices, singers, each contributing to the whole. Launching a canoe was a sacred act. Departing on a journey meant invoking the protection of the ancestors, offering gifts to the sea, and trusting the knowledge handed down over generations. And though the ocean was vast, it did not divide. It connected. Trade routes were formed between islands, exchanges of obsidian, shell, food, and stories. Marriages created bonds between distant clans. Ceremonial knowledge was shared across wide distances. Even today, the languages of the Pacific, from Hawaii to Madagascar, trace back to a common root, spoken long ago beside some unknown shore. Eventually, as European explorers arrived in these regions, they were astonished to find that the so-called isolated islanders had rich, complex systems of navigation, astronomy, and oral history. What seemed to outsiders like empty ocean was, in truth, a world of memory, crisscrossed with invisible paths known by heart. Today, the revival of traditional voyaging continues. Navigators once again train without instruments, canoes are built with ancestral methods, and journeys are made to honor the past. These voyages are not reenactments, but acts of living culture, reminders that ancient knowledge, carried in silence and song, still flows beneath the stars. The Pacific peoples, often overlooked in the sweeping narratives of empire and conquest, offer a different model of greatness, not in walls or war, but in balance, in continuity, in the graceful crossing of the unknown. And as the canoes glide softly through moonlit waters, guided by stars that never forget their paths, we begin to see history not only as something fixed in place, but something always moving, like the ocean itself. Ahead, that ocean will touch distant shores, where new civilizations, in the forests, plains, and mountains of the Americas, were also rising in their own rhythm, in harmony with land and sky. In the vast and layered world of ancient cities, daily life unfolded not in grand pronouncements, but in small and steady gestures. Beneath the towering walls of temples and the long shadows of palaces, people moved through narrow streets, carried goods in woven baskets, exchanged greetings, and tended to the tasks that gave their lives both structure and spirit. The city, though built of stone and clay, pulsed with something softer, a rhythm of labor and leisure, of voices and footsteps, of memory carried in the folds of fabric, the shape of a loaf, the tune of a simple song. Markets were at the heart of many cities, open spaces where trade flowed like water, constant and vital. Each morning, the square came alive. Merchants laid out their goods on mats or wooden stands, bundles of herbs, baskets of fruit, bolts of dyed cloth, copper tools, and jars of fragrant oil. Animals lowed and clucked in pens nearby. Bakers called out prices for fresh bread, still warm from stone ovens. Potters displayed delicate bowls and wide-mouthed jars, their surfaces etched with designs drawn from land, river, and sky. Bartering was common. Coins were used in some places, but more often trade was based on value remembered, trusted, and agreed upon. A length of linen for a sack of barley, a carved bead for a measure of salt. These transactions were not impersonal. They were part of a relationship built over time between neighbors, travelers, and families. Gossip traveled as quickly as goods. News of births, marriages, and local disputes passed from mouth to mouth alongside discussions of harvests and weather. Music threaded through the marketplace too, played on reed pipes, stringed lyres, hand drums, and wooden flutes. Children danced in circles. Street performers juggled or told stories in song. Some tunes were light, made for laughter. Others were old and slow, passed down across generations, echoing with memory. Music was not reserved for performance alone. It was a companion to labor, a balm for grief, a celebration and feast. Women hummed while grinding grain. Shepherds played melodies to calm their flocks. Soldiers marched to rhythm. Rituals were sung as much as spoken. Inside the home, life was shaped by craft and care. In many ancient cities, homes shared walls, creating winding clusters of rooms and courtyards. The architecture was practical, but also intimate. Outer rooms opened onto the street for cooking, storing, or working, while inner spaces held sleeping mats, family altars, and places for gathering. Courtyards offered light, air, and a space for meals, games, or quiet talk. Water was drawn from wells or fountains, poured into ceramic jars, cooled by shade and stone. Cooking was done over small fires, often in clay ovens or braziers. Meals were simple, yet rich with flavor. Lentil stews spiced with garlic and herbs, flatbreads brushed with oil, fruits dried for winter, olives and nuts, cheese and honey. Food was shared, and mealtime was more than sustenance. It was a daily ceremony of togetherness. Children learned to help from a young age, fetching, stirring, tasting, learning through repetition and story. Storytelling was central to family life. Evenings brought gathering, around the fire, on rooftops beneath the stars, or within the cool shelter of home. Elders told tales of ancestors and gods, of travelers and tricksters, of the stars above and the spirits beneath. Some stories taught lessons, others simply entertained, but all were carriers of memory, shaping identity, planting values, and threading each child into the larger fabric of their people. In wealthier homes, literacy might find its way into daily life. A small wooden tablet for practice, a scroll read aloud, a letter carried from a distant friend or relative. In poorer homes, memory was the medium. Songs, proverbs, and repeated rituals served the same function as books. They held knowledge, comfort, and belonging. Textiles added beauty and meaning to even the simplest homes. Curtains dyed with natural pigments, rugs woven with geometric patterns, shawls embroidered with birds, flowers, or protective symbols. Each stitch, each color choice, often held significance, a signal of family, region, or belief. Clothing, too, was expressive. Tunics, cloaks, belts, sandals, all chosen with care, whether for a festival or for a day's labor. Even a simple bead or pendant might carry memory, a gift from a mother, a charm against illness, a mark of a story known only to the wearer. Memory in ancient cities was kept not only in objects or stories, but in the way people moved through their world. The path to the well, the time of day when shadows fell across the square, the spot where a grandmother once sat spinning thread. These were not marked by monuments, but by habit, layers of meaning woven into the everyday. Cities remembered through movement, repetition, and care. And while life was often hard, illness, loss, and labor never far, it was also full of joy. Weddings filled the streets with song. Births brought neighbors with baskets of bread and fruit. Harvests were celebrated with feasts and garlands. Even in grief, people gathered, offering food, flowers, and memory in the face of death. These cities, from Uruk to Thebes, Mohenjo-Daro to Enyang, were not only centers of power, they were places of living. Places where time was marked, not just by conquest, but by meals shared, songs sung, walls swept clean each morning, and the feeling of returning home. And while kings and scribes shaped the visible skyline, it was the quiet culture of daily life that gave the city its soul. As trade expanded and cultures touched across distances, these rhythms would carry outward, into new lands, over sea and sand, and soon, in regions yet untouched by empire, people would begin to gather and build in their own ways, creating new centers of life in distant corners of the world. Long before ships crossed the Atlantic or traders dreamed of distant continents, great civilizations had already risen across the Americas. From the humid jungles of Mesoamerica to the windswept peaks of the Andes, people built cities of stone, mapped the movements of the sky, cultivated complex agricultural systems, and honored their ancestors through ritual and craft. These cultures did not follow the same path as those of the Old World. Their timelines and technologies were different, but the rhythm was familiar, a soft and steady shaping of the world, guided by seasons, stars, and memory. In the heart of present-day Mexico, long before the rise of the Aztecs, a city known as Teotihuacan emerged from the volcanic earth. By the first centuries of the Common Era, it had become one of the largest cities in the world, a carefully planned metropolis of wide avenues, terraced housing, open plazas, and immense stone pyramids. The Pyramid of the Sun and the Pyramid of the Moon still stand today, worn by time but still watching the sky. These structures were aligned with celestial bodies, suggesting a people deeply attuned to the rhythms above. Teotihuacan was not built on conquest alone. It thrived through trade, craftsmanship, and spiritual practice. Obsidian tools, fine pottery, vibrant murals, and incense burners were produced in vast numbers and carried across the region. The city was home to diverse peoples, speaking different languages, worshiping in their own ways. It was in its time a cultural crossroads, a quiet echo of the complex interdependence that defines all great human centers. Farther south, the Maya civilization flourished in the tropical forests of present-day Guatemala, Belize, Honduras, and southern Mexico. From around 2000 BCE to the arrival of Europeans in the 16th century, the Maya developed a sophisticated and enduring culture. Their cities rose in the forest like islands of stone: Tikal, Copan, Palenque, Calakmul, and many more. Each was governed by its own rulers, but linked through trade, diplomacy, and shared beliefs. The Maya were master astronomers and mathematicians. They charted eclipses, calculated the movements of Venus, and developed a calendar system of astonishing precision. Their writing, a complex set of glyphs combining logograms and phonetic symbols, was carved into stone, painted on ceramics, and inscribed in codices made of bark paper. These texts recorded the births and deaths of kings, the timing of rituals, and the turning of cosmic ages. At the heart of Maya life was the concept of cyclical time. The world moved in great circles, not toward an end, but through endless renewal. Rituals honored this rhythm, offerings of food, incense, music, and sometimes blood were made to maintain the balance between human and divine. Temples rose like mountains from the flat forest floor, their stairs steep and narrow, guiding pilgrims and priests toward the sky. In the highlands of South America, the Andes cradled another great civilization, the Inca. By the 15th century, the Inca Empire stretched across thousands of miles, from modern-day Colombia to Chile, connected by a network of stone-paved roads and suspension bridges that traversed rivers, canyons, and mountain passes. Yet even before the empire, Andean cultures such as the Chavin, Moche, Nazca, and Wari had already laid deep foundations, building ceremonial centers, carving vast geoglyphs into desert plains, and weaving stories into cloth and gold. The Inca, though lacking a written script, developed one of the most efficient administrative systems of the ancient world. They used quipus, bundles of knotted strings, to record information about population, tribute, and storage. Their roads linked coastal cities with highland villages, connecting temple to terrace, palace to port. Runners carried messages across great distances, resting at way stations built precisely a day's journey apart. Their capital, Cusco, was designed in the shape of a puma, a sacred animal, with palaces, temples, and plazas radiating outward like the body's limbs. And high above, nestled among clouds and cliffs, lay Machu Picchu, a royal retreat or sacred site, its stone walls cut so precisely that even centuries later, they still resist the blade of a knife. Here, the sacred and the practical met in harmony, agriculture, astronomy, ceremony, and shelter woven seamlessly into the contours of the land. Agriculture in the Americas was no less ingenious. In the valleys of Peru, complex terracing systems allowed for the cultivation of maize, potatoes, quinoa, and other crops across varied altitudes. In Mesoamerica, the milpa system, rotating crops of maize, beans, and squash, nourished both land and people. Chinampas, or floating gardens, transformed shallow lakebeds into fertile farmland near cities like Tenochtitlan, the capital of the later Aztec Empire. And yet, even amid temples and empires, daily life remained rooted in family, in ceremony, in a closeness to the land. The hearth fire, the grinding of maize, the weaving of cloth from alpaca wool or cotton, the carving of bone or shell into tools, beads, or sacred items. Stories passed through generations, not always written, but remembered in dance, tattoo, and song. The peoples of the Americas, diverse and far-reaching, did not think of themselves as one. Their languages, customs, and beliefs varied widely, but they shared something quietly profound, a reverence for place. The mountain was not just stone, it was spirit. The river was not just water, it was a path between worlds. The sun, moon, and stars were not distant or decorative, but active presences, guides, protectors, and sometimes judges. When the first Europeans arrived, they often failed to see the deep time etched into these lands. They saw forests, temples, and gold, but not the centuries of memory, the precision of planning, the balance between world and wonder. Yet even as conquest reshaped these civilizations, the roots remained. The stories endured, buried in fields, sung in secret, danced beneath the moon. Long before the modern world circled the globe, long before oceans were charted and continents stitched together by trade, the peoples of the Americas had already shaped their own human worlds, in rhythm with the soil, in awe of the sky, and in quiet conversation with the sacred spaces they called home. Ahead, these cultures would encounter waves of change, contact, conflict, exchange, and the ancient world would slowly begin to give way to something new. But in the soft light of early morning, with mist curling through trees and wind brushing temple stones, the echoes of these civilizations still whisper, "We were here. We lived, we shaped the land with our hands, and we remembered the stars." Even in the quietest corners of the ancient world, people were never still for long. Long before trains and ships, long before borders were drawn on paper, humans moved, slowly, carefully, and with deep purpose. They followed the shape of rivers, the curves of coastlines, the pathways worn by hoof and foot. Some traveled to find new land, others to exchange goods, still others simply to see what lay beyond the next rise. And though their movements were often unseen, they left behind a subtle pattern, threads of connection stretching across deserts, mountains, and oceans. Trade was among the earliest and most enduring reasons for travel. By the time great cities had risen in Mesopotamia, Egypt, and the Indus Valley, merchants were already crossing hundreds of miles to exchange goods. Obsidian from Anatolia reached the Levant. Lapis lazuli from Afghanistan appeared in tombs along the Nile. Tin from distant mines found its way into bronze workshops, and always along with goods came stories, bits of language, ideas, fashions, and fragments of belief that wove cultures together more quietly than any army. The Silk Road is often remembered as the greatest of these ancient trade routes, though it was never a single road, but a web. Beginning in China, it crossed through Central Asia, linking the Han Empire with Persia, India, and the Mediterranean. Silks, spices, tea, horses, jade, and ceramics flowed westward. Glass, wine, wool, and precious metals moved east. But it was not only items that passed through these routes, it was knowledge. Paper, gunpowder, medical texts, philosophical ideas, and religious stories all traveled alongside merchants and monks, each one a soft ambassador of its place of origin. Caravans moved slowly, sometimes a dozen camels, sometimes hundreds, stepping across the sand in careful rhythm. Traders braved sandstorms, bandits, and the endless solitude of high mountain passes, but they were not alone. Along the way, caravanserais dotted the road, way stations where travelers could rest, share news, and repair their loads. These oases of exchange became small centers of multicultural life, where Persian poets, Chinese monks, Arab merchants, and Turkic guides might sit beside one another and speak through gestures, shared language, or the universal language of food. The sea offered another path. Long before modern navigation, coastal communities had learned to read the tides, the stars, and the behavior of seabirds. The Indian Ocean became a great maritime highway, less famous than the Silk Road, but no less vital. Monsoon winds, shifting predictably with the seasons, allowed sailors to journey from the Arabian Peninsula to India, from East Africa to the islands of Southeast Asia. Dhows with their triangular sails caught the wind with grace. Ports like Aden, Calicut, and Malacca grew into quiet empires of trade. In the Mediterranean, the Phoenicians were among the first great seafarers. From their city-states along the coast of modern Lebanon, they sailed westward, establishing colonies and trading posts throughout North Africa, Spain, and beyond. Their alphabet, simple and adaptable, would eventually inspire the scripts of the Greeks and Romans. They carried cedar, glass, purple dye, and tales of distant lands where the sun lingered longer and the seas turned cold. Even further afield, there were hints of contact between distant peoples. Roman coins have been found in India. Chinese silks have been uncovered in Egyptian tombs. And though these exchanges were rare and difficult, they remind us that the ancient world was never as isolated as it sometimes seems. People were curious. They wondered what lay beyond the mountains, beyond the horizon, beyond the desert's end. Travel was not always commercial. Pilgrimage, as we have seen, sent people walking for weeks, months, or years towards sacred springs, temples, or mountains. Diplomats journeyed between empires, bearing gifts and letters sealed with wax and gold. Scholars traveled in search of knowledge, carrying scrolls and tablets, visiting libraries and schools far from home. Even entertainers moved from court to court, dancers, musicians, acrobats, bringing joy and novelty wherever they went. The edges of the ancient map were not always real. They were places of wonder, filled with imagined creatures, mysterious peoples, and lands of eternal twilight. But these imagined spaces, too, held meaning. They reminded people that the world was larger than they knew, that mystery still existed, and that exploration was itself a sacred act. Maps, when they were drawn, reflected more than geography, they reflected worldview. The center was always one's own land: Babylon, Jerusalem, Delphi, Chang'an. Around it spiraled rivers, mountains, seas, and the unfamiliar. And while most people never traveled far from home, they still carried with them an awareness of distant lands, shaped by the stories of travelers, the arrival of foreign goods, and the subtle shift of language as neighbors met neighbors. And so the world before the modern age was already interconnected, not by machines or empires alone, but by footsteps, wind, and the quiet courage of those who walked toward the unknown. These ancient networks of trade, travel, and tale laid the foundation for a new kind of world, one where distant peoples would eventually meet in more permanent and sometimes painful ways. But before that chapter begins, we pause once more to listen to the world as it was, full of voices, flavors, fabrics, and dreams that stretched far beyond the edges of the map. And in the gentle dusk of the ancient world, we hear the hum of that movement, of ships creaking on calm seas, of caravans climbing high passes, of songs sung in unfamiliar tongues, soft and full of wonder. The 4 gears ticked behind glass or bells rang from clock towers. Time moved differently. It flowed not in minutes or hours, but in shadows, ripening fruit, bird migrations, and the rise and fall of stars. The ancient world knew time not as a fixed march, but as a quiet turning of days into nights, of moons into seasons, of lives into memory. And across the world, people shaped their lives around these movements, reading the sky like a great and living book. The sun was the most visible clock, rising and setting, casting shadows that lengthened and vanished. Across Africa, Asia, the Americas, and beyond, people observed the sun's position with careful attention. They marked solstices and equinoxes, the longest and shortest days, the moments when light and dark balanced. In Britain, the stones of Stonehenge align with the midsummer sunrise. In Peru, at Machu Picchu and other Inca sites, windows and stones catch the sun precisely on key dates. These were not accidents, they were acts of reverence and precision, ways to anchor time and place. The moon offered another rhythm, quieter but more subtle, its waxing and waning tied to tides, fertility, planting, and ceremony. Many early calendars were lunar. In Mesopotamia, the new moon marked the beginning of a month. In China, festivals like the Mid-Autumn celebration honored the full moon's glow. In Mesoamerica, the Maya tracked both lunar and solar cycles with remarkable accuracy, weaving them into complex calendar systems that guided rituals, harvests, and royal events. Stars provided the broader arc of time, constellations that appeared and vanished with the seasons. In Egypt, the rising of Sirius just before dawn heralded the annual flooding of the Nile, a sacred and vital event. In Polynesia, navigators watched the positions of stars like the Southern Cross to guide their journeys. The Greeks named and storied the constellations, linking them to myths, while in India, nakshatras, lunar mansions, divided the sky into segments for astrology and agriculture alike. These observations were not merely scientific, they were spiritual. Time was not separate from life. It was life, a pattern of becoming and returning, of light emerging from dark and returning again. Rituals followed these rhythms. Offerings were made at new moons, crops were planted under auspicious stars, festivals marked turning points, harvest, solstice, first snow, first bloom. Each moment was part of a larger circle, and every act was a step within it. Calendars slowly emerged, first as memory, then as marks. In Mesopotamia, scribes used clay tablets to track days and months. In Egypt, papyrus scrolls recorded solar calendars of 365 days. The Maya developed multiple overlapping calendars, the Tzolk'in, a 260-day ritual cycle, the Hab, a solar year, and the Long Count, which tracked great cosmic ages, stretching far into the past and future. These calendars were not only practical, they were philosophical, even poetic. Views of time as both cyclical and sacred. In China, the traditional calendar blended lunar and solar observations. It guided not only farming but festivals, fortune-telling, and family customs. New Year celebrations, moon viewing festivals, and days of remembrance were all tied to this rhythm. The calendar itself was seen as a reflection of cosmic harmony, a balance between yin and yang, heaven and earth. Without mechanical clocks, people still told time in their own ways. Sundials used a stick and a shadow. Water clocks, or clepsydras, dripped at a steady pace into marked containers. In China, some clocks used incense that burned at predictable rates, releasing different scents as time passed. Candle clocks, marked with notches, melted slowly through the hours of night. Each was a gentle answer to the question, how much time has passed? But time in the ancient world was also deeply human. It was marked not just by stars or tools, but by moments lived, a child's first steps, the first frost of winter, the song of birds returning in spring, a long absence, a long-awaited return. The heart knew time not in digits but in feeling. And across cultures, time was often imagined as a spiral rather than a straight line, an endless returning, where past and future touched. Ancestral spirits walked beside the living. Old stories returned in new forms. Festivals reenacted creation myths, not just to remember, but to renew. In this way, time was sacred, alive, and participatory. To live in harmony with time was to live in balance with the world. Even today, remnants of these rhythms remain. We still celebrate solstices and equinoxes, new moons and harvests. We still look up at the stars and feel a sense of ancient knowing. And in quiet moments, when a shadow falls just right, or the moon catches our eye, we remember that long before we measured time, we listened to it. We watched it unfold in light and silence. And so, the ancients, with no ticking clocks or blinking screens, moved through time with patience, with ceremony, and with awe. They knew what we sometimes forget, that time is not a thing to chase or control. It is something to be noticed, honored, and lived, moment by moment, as gently as the turning of the earth beneath our feet. Ahead, in the final chapters of this journey, we begin to watch as the ancient world nears its close, reshaped by migrations, transformations, and new encounters that would carry its memory into the next great age of humanity. Change in the ancient world did not arrive with the blast of trumpets or the fall of cities. It came gently, like twilight, a slow fading of one kind of world into another. As the Great Migration settled into new rhythms, as old temples crumbled and new ideas took root, the ancient world began to turn, gradually, into something different. From the ashes of early empires and the soil of long-settled lands, the classical civilizations emerged, not as replacements, but as continuations, shaped by memory, layered with new ambition, and tuned to a deeper sense of permanence. This transformation did not happen in one place. It was a quiet unfolding across continents. In Greece, small city-states like Athens and Sparta began to rise from the rocky landscape, their citizens debating politics in public squares and worshiping gods on hilltop altars. In Rome, a humble village on the banks of the Tiber would soon grow into a republic, and then an empire, its roads stretching outward like veins from a beating heart. In China, dynasties rose with vision and order, first the Zhou, then the Qin and Han, building walls and codifying laws, stitching the country together with silk roads and sacred rites. What defines this turning from ancient to classical is not only scale, but mindset. In the ancient world, time often felt circular, bound to the cycles of stars and seasons, but in the classical world, a new sense of time emerged, forward-looking, record-keeping, history-making. People began to write not just what was, but why. They asked what should be. They built not just for gods, but for posterity. Stone was carved with names and dates. Deeds were recorded. Lives, once only remembered through stories, were now etched in texts, letters, and law codes. Greece, in particular, offered a new lens on the human experience. Its thinkers turned their gaze toward reason and the self. Its poets sang of war, love, and honor, not only as divine gifts, but as human choices. Its sculptors shaped marble into figures that breathed with quiet strength. Its citizens, at least the privileged few, gathered to vote, to argue, to imagine what it meant to live well. This was not yet democracy as we know it, nor was it equality, but it was a seed, planted in the rich soil of conversation and contemplation. Rome, meanwhile, looked outward. From a patchwork of tribes and alliances, it grew into a power defined by structure, its legions disciplined, its roads precise, its legal system enduring. Rome absorbed the cultures it encountered, honoring local gods, adopting languages and practices, and binding its vast territories through law, citizenship, and the shared dream of order. Yet beneath the marble forums and grand villas, the rhythms of older life persisted. Farmers still rose with the sun, bakers still kneaded dough by hand, children still listened to stories by firelight. In the East, China moved with its own profound momentum. The Qin dynasty, brief but impactful, standardized weights, measures, and writing, carving a foundation for unity. The Han dynasty followed, expanding territory, refining bureaucracy, and nurturing the arts. Confucian ideals guided governance, while Taoist philosophy offered balance and stillness. Paper was invented, medicine advanced. And along the Silk Road, China reached toward the world, exchanging goods and ideas with cultures it might never see, but always imagined. India, too, saw its own classical age unfold. The Maurya Empire, under rulers like Ashoka, embraced Buddhism and spread it beyond the subcontinent. The Gupta Empire nurtured science, literature, and art, golden figures in stone, detailed astronomical charts, stories that would later become epics shared across Asia. Sanskrit texts were composed and copied, shaping thought and faith for centuries. And all along the Ganges and beyond, life continued in its intimate forms, in river villages, forest hermitages, and bustling markets. In the Americas, cultures like the Maya entered their classical phase. Great city-states rose with stepped pyramids, palace complexes, and observatories. Hieroglyphs recorded events, ceremonies, and lineages. Calendars grew more precise, and rituals more refined. These were not isolated people, but deeply connected to their past, to the cosmos, and to each other through trade and shared tradition. What binds all these regions together is not uniformity, but transition. The classical world was not a break from the ancient, it was its flowering. It took the tools shaped in earlier centuries, writing, agriculture, navigation, belief, and built upon them. It sought not just to survive, but to endure. And in doing so, it laid foundations we still walk upon. Of course, not all was peace. These centuries also saw war, enslavement, inequality, and loss. Great cities fell as quickly as they rose. Knowledge was lost, sometimes by accident, sometimes by design. But even in these darker moments, something persisted, a yearning to remember, to rebuild, to record. And so the world turned, quietly, from ancient to classical, not with a single step, but with many. Not in silence, but in the soft murmur of scribes copying texts, of stones set upon each other in new foundations, of old stories told in new voices. As we near the end of this journey through the ancient world, we pause here, on the threshold of a new age. Behind us lie the caves, fields, temples, and hearths of those who shaped the earliest chapters of human history. Ahead lies the long unfolding of what we call civilization, larger, louder, and more recorded, but still deeply human. And through it all we carry the quiet memory of where we began, with firelight, with footsteps, with the simple, enduring wonder of being in the world. History is often imagined as still, maps pinned with borders, cities fixed in place. But beneath every settlement lies a deeper truth. Humans move. we have always moved. Long before the modern world drew clean lines across the land, families, clans, and entire cultures followed rivers, seasons, pastures, and stars. Some migrations were sudden, brought on by drought, war, or flood. Others unfolded slowly, over generations, with each step carrying not only bodies, but language, customs, and memory. As the ancient world matured and its first empires rose and fell, great migrations began to ripple across the continents. These movements were not always recorded, and rarely were they loud, but their impact would shape the face of the earth. Not through monuments, but through the steady reshaping of culture, land, and connection. In Europe, long before the rise of Rome, waves of Indo-European-speaking peoples had already spread from the steppes north of the Black and Caspian Seas into Central and Western Europe, South Asia, and beyond. They brought with them new languages, many of which would form the roots of modern tongues: Sanskrit, Greek, Latin, Persian, Celtic, and Germanic, all branching from the same deep linguistic tree. These migrants often traveled with their animals, carts, and oral traditions. They settled in valleys, on hillsides, and along rivers, blending with or displacing the people they encountered. The cultures that emerged were hybrids, local and new, familiar and strange. In Central Europe, the Hallstatt and La Tène cultures would eventually give rise to the Celts, known for their intricate metalwork, hill forts, and oral storytelling traditions that stretched like vines across the land. Farther east, nomadic peoples rode with the wind across the great Eurasian steppes. The Scythians, Sarmatians, and others lived not in cities but on horseback, herding sheep and cattle, hunting with precision, and crafting golden ornaments that caught the light of sun and fire alike. Their movements often brushed against settled empires, bringing both trade and tension. These cultures left fewer written records, but they lived fully in motion, tracing vast arcs across the land as quietly as weather patterns. In sub-Saharan Africa, one of the most significant and far-reaching migrations began to unfold: the Bantu expansion. Over thousands of years, Bantu-speaking peoples moved slowly from the region around modern-day Cameroon and Nigeria toward the south and east, carrying with them knowledge of ironworking, agriculture, and language. Their movement reshaped the linguistic and cultural map of Africa. They cleared forest for crops, raised livestock, and established villages wherever water and fertile land allowed. Along the way, they blended with older hunter-gatherer groups, creating rich regional cultures that still echo today in language, rhythm, and art. Across the Americas, too, people were always moving, often following ecological change, resource shifts, or cycles of drought and rain. Some movements led to the founding of new cities. Others gave rise to new alliances, languages, and ceremonial centers. In the North American Southwest, for example, ancestral Puebloan peoples built intricate cliff dwellings and multi-room structures, only to later move on, leaving behind silent stone, not abandonment, but transformation. In the forests of the eastern woodlands, cultures like the Hopewell and Mississippian emerged, drawing from distant trade networks, shared ritual symbols, and slowly evolving migrations over river and ridge. In South and Southeast Asia, waves of migration were often more subtle, blending into the rise of kingdoms and trade routes. Seafaring peoples from what is now Indonesia and the Philippines had long moved across the seas, reaching as far as Madagascar by canoe, thousands of miles across open water, carrying banana plants, chickens, and language to a new shore. And in the vast cold of the north, the early ancestors of the Turkic and Mongolic peoples roamed the taiga and steppe, herding reindeer, hunting game, and preserving knowledge of survival in some of the world's most demanding climates. These cultures, shaped by endurance and sky, would later rise to great influence, but their roots were always in movement. Migrations were not always peaceful. Sometimes they brought conflict, as groups competed for the same lands or resources. Sometimes they brought disease, new hierarchies, or cultural erosion. But they also brought renewal, a mixing of customs, languages, beliefs, and crafts. New foods, tools, and stories passed from one people to another, often without words. A way of shaping pottery, a particular way to sing, a symbol drawn in the dirt, carried far and wide. For those who moved, memory was everything. Without permanent structures, people carried the past in song, in spoken names, in the shape of rituals and the stories told at night beside campfires. A river might be remembered for a lost child, a hill for a long-past battle. The stars for a journey survived. The land itself became an archive, not written, but walked. And though few ancient maps recorded these paths, we now know how wide and intricate they were. Genetic traces, linguistic clues, and archaeological finds reveal a world always in motion. A bead from the Nile, found in a distant grave. A plant species domesticated thousands of miles from its origin. A story told in two places, with different words, but the same quiet heart. Migration is often framed as an end of home, of peace, but it is also a beginning. It is resilience. It is the courage to keep walking, to seek water, to trust the land. And it is deeply human, as ancient as breath, as old as the first foot pressed into soft earth. As the ancient world neared its twilight, and the classical world rose in Greece, Rome, China, and beyond, these movements continued, sometimes hidden beneath the grand histories of emperors, but always present. And in every new city, every new village, there was someone who had come from somewhere else, someone who remembered another sky. Ahead, the ancient world would begin to shift into something more familiar to modern memory. A world of roads paved in stone, of written law, of vast empires stretching across continents. But the roots of that world were carried, step by step, by people who moved not to rule, but simply to live. The ancient world, though long vanished in its original form, still lingers, not as ruins alone, but as rhythm. It hums beneath modern life like a distant melody, familiar and half-remembered, shaping how we walk, speak, believe, and build. Its voices, once soft with age, have never truly gone silent. They echo in architecture and story, in fields and festivals, in the ordinary rituals of daily life. What it left behind was not only memory, but momentum, a quiet current that carries us still. Perhaps the most lasting inheritance is the sense of being part of something larger. Ancient people lived close to the land, to the sky, to the slow cycles of time. They knew that life was not only what one did, but how one belonged to a family, a river, a tradition, a dream. That belonging was expressed through everything they touched. The curve of a bowl, the layout of a village, the names whispered to the stars at night. These weren't grand declarations, but small affirmations repeated over lifetimes. Writing is one of the great gifts that emerged from this age, not merely as a tool, but as a gesture of trust in the future. When early scribes etched symbols into wet clay or inked characters onto parchment, they were reaching beyond themselves. They believed that someone, someday, might need to know, might want to understand. Whether recording grain stores or composing hymns to the sun, their impulse was the same: to preserve, to pass on, to anchor fleeting thought in something more lasting. That impulse to remember shaped everything. Calendars, myths, songs, and carvings all carried time forward like a vessel. In temples and tombs, in roadside shrines and quiet household altars, the past was made present. And even when empires crumbled or scripts were forgotten, these containers of memory remained. A story told beside a fire, a stone aligned to solstice light, a path worn into the earth by centuries of feet. These too are archives, kept not in libraries, but in life. The ancient world also taught the quiet strength of adaptation. Over time, people adjusted to climate, to neighbors, to the rise and fall of fortune. Civilizations endured not by holding rigidly to one form, but by listening to the earth, to each other, to the shifts of season and need. A village would move closer to water. A temple would be rebuilt with new stone. A language would borrow a word and make it its own. In this way, survival was not resistance, but receptivity. Perhaps the most human of all the ancient legacies is the search for meaning. In cave art, in pyramid and poem, people asked the same questions we ask now. Why are we here? What happens when we die? How should we live? Their answers varied, beautifully and wildly. Some saw gods in the stars, others found them in rivers or ancestors or silence. Some offered sacrifice, others offered song. But all of them, across time and land, reached towards something unseen, something sacred. We see this reaching in the ruins of temples, in fragments of law, in the slow unfolding of philosophical texts. We see it in early medicine and astronomy, in the care taken to bury the dead, in the choice to plant seeds and wait. These were acts of faith, not always religious, but always relational. They connected past to future, self to community, moment to meaning, and the lessons remain. We still draw lines of time. We still name our days and months after gods and emperors. We still teach through stories older than cities. We still walk paths laid down thousands of years ago, some literal, some invisible but just as real. A lullaby, a tool passed from parent to child, a festival that lights the night in remembrance of ancestors. These are the echoes, not loud, but lasting. Even the great monuments, the pyramids, the ziggurats, the terraced fields, the carved stelae, speak less of power than of care. They were built not only to impress, but to endure, to remind. They tell us not just who ruled or what was believed, but how people hoped that someone would come after, that someone would see, and we do see. We visit these places, read these texts, mimic their styles, ask their questions again and again. We call them ancient, but they live with us still, not as relics, but as roots. Every city, every ritual, every piece of knowledge we claim has some thread that leads back to those early weavers of the world. The ancient world was not one place, it was not one story. It was a vast, unfolding conversation, carried by river and road, by sail and step, by silence and song. It asked us to listen, to notice, to belong, and so we do. When we sit with old stories, when we plant for the next season, when we walk under the same stars they once watched in awe, when we speak softly to children, or carve something beautiful from what we have. These are the echoes. This is the inheritance, not a past to escape, but a foundation to stand upon. Quiet, enduring, and full of life. There is a stillness that comes at the end of a long journey. Not the stillness of emptiness, but of fullness, of knowing one has walked far, listened deeply, and arrived at a place of quiet understanding. So it is with the story of the ancient world. Not a single tale, but a vast unfolding of life, shaped over millennia by countless hands and hearts. And now, as the sun sets gently across the fields of history, we sit with it all, the known and the forgotten, the grand and the humble, the voices that rose in stone, and those that passed softly through the air. What remains is not just knowledge, but presence. The sense that we are never far from those earliest humans who shaped the land with patience, who gazed at the stars with questions, who made meaning from wind and fire and shadow. We carry them still in our breath, in our stories, in the paths we walk without knowing why. To reflect on the ancient world is to be reminded of scale, not the scale of empire, but of time itself. 1,000 years to them was as real and slow as a season is to us. Trees planted at the founding of a village grew tall by the time of a grandchild's birth. Songs passed down were shaped and reshaped, but their spirit endured. In that sense, time was not distant, it was intimate. It held hands with memory and walked beside the living. It's also to remember the ordinary. For every king who ruled from a golden throne, there were thousands who rose with the sun, baked bread, spun thread, and whispered to children beneath star-filled skies. These lives were not less meaningful for their lack of monuments. They were rich with care, effort, wonder. They gave the world its pulse, one footstep, one breath, one quiet gesture at a time. The ancient world offers no single lesson, no final answer. It offers a field of echoes, wide enough to hold joy and sorrow, belief and doubt, beauty and fear. It reminds us that complexity is not new. That every tool we use, every word we speak, has a lineage that reaches far into the past. That we are, in many ways, not inventing life, but continuing it, adding our voice to a story that began long before us. And what a story it is! From the flicker of early firelight in forgotten caves to the rise of cities beneath desert skies. From lone footsteps across windswept tundra to the careful carving of temples into mountainsides. From hushed prayers to invisible gods to the building of roads that stretched beyond the horizon. A story not of perfection, but of persistence. Not of progress alone, but of presence. There is comfort in this. If we let it settle, the problems we face are not entirely new. Neither are the hopes we hold. Others have walked through difficulty, through uncertainty, through longing. They planted trees, told stories, built homes, and dreamed of futures they could not fully see. And here we are, living in the shadow of those dreams, shaping our own. To rest in the ancient story is to feel small in the best of ways, not diminished but connected. To see the human journey not as a race, but as a rhythm, one that invites us to move gently, to pay attention, to leave something of beauty behind for those who will come after. Perhaps that is the soft wisdom of the ancient world, that life is not meant to be hurried, that meaning does not always come in clarity, but often in quietness, that even in darkness, there is always a fire, tended, watched, shared. And so we rest, we let the story lie beside us like a warm woven cloth, frayed at the edges, but rich with pattern. We breathe with the knowledge that time continues, that memory endures, and that somewhere, across the fields of sleep, the ancient world still turns beneath the same stars. The stars they watched, the stars we still see, silent, steady, and full of light.